Two young girls watched the scuffle fearfully. Jin-Soo Han, a third-year general surgery student, and another young man were having a fist fight. Before that, the student and the girl were having fun. There were drinks and food on the table. But the second man touched the girl inappropriately, which made Jin-Soo Han mad. It wasn't just a stranger, it was his supervisor. Jin-Soo responded to his indignation at how he dared to hit the leader by saying that he could tolerate many things except impolite treatment of his girlfriend. The consequences of such an act were not long in coming. Jin-Soo Han was kicked out of the university hospital. After that, he tried to find another private hospital but was rejected everywhere. After some time, he managed to meet an investor who could help open a small private clinic. But the investor turned out to be a fraud and absconded with all the money Jin-Soo Han had invested in opening the hospital. He went to the police to find this crook and get his money back. There, he learned that this investor was a friend of Chin Kim, and the girl suggested we stop talking about the wedding. She met someone better and suggested Jin-Soo Han to break up. From all these events, the recently successful young man fell into despair and tried to forget himself. His life was completely ruined in a very short period of time, but he was still determined to resolve the situation. But to do that, he had to apologize to the supervisor who started it all. Gaining courage, he entered the office and saw a couple kissing there. The kissing scene between his ex-girlfriend and his supervisor made Jin-Soo Han mad. Caught off guard, they tried to justify themselves. The girl said that she was forced and the manager that it was a misunderstanding. In the darkness, Jin-Soo Han was returning home. The street was deserted with only a young man standing by the wall. He called out the student by name, and Jin-Soo responded in surprise. But the stranger was not expecting that with good intentions. He clamped the young man's mouth shut and stabbed him in the stomach. He then loaded the unconscious Jin-Soo into the trunk of the car. The attacker took him into the woods and dumped him in a prepared pit. Jin-Soo woke up and called for help, but the stranger reported to the professor that the job was done and he was waiting for the money for the work. Clods of earth flew at the student, and he had time to think that perhaps the customer was Chin Kim. The land was getting bigger and it was getting harder to breathe. Jin-Soo thought that it was unfair and unjust. The stranger completed his business and completely filled the hole with earth. In the darkness, Jong-Soo Han heard sounds and opened his eyes. His spirit was floating in space. His life was summarized. The good deeds outnumbered the bad. With the points he earned from his deeds, he could buy a ticket to heaven or resurrection. Jin-Soo thought he had been wounded too seriously and wasn't sure if he was alive now. He was informed that he was a new spirit who had recently left the body, and that he was on the judgment stage where it was decided whether the spirit would go to heaven or hell. He was offered the choice of heaven or resurrection. He was given 30 seconds to think about it. If there was no answer, the spirit automatically went to heaven. The countdown began and Jin-Soo Han panicked. He needed more time to think. When the 30 seconds were practically up, he ventured to resurrect. Now he had to choose the place to be reborn and apply the knowledge he had gained in life. He was offered 3 places: where there are many patients, where there are less than 20 patients, and where there are less than 10 patients. Jin-Soo Han decided that where there were more patients, he could save more lives and of course earn more money. And he voiced his decision and his intention to remain a doctor. Then he had to make many more important decisions that influenced the future. Jin-Soo tried to figure out who he was communicating with, but he began to be swirled into a vortex of light. Then he woke up in this daytime lying on the ground, but for some reason he was in pain. Jin-Soo thought it was a healing wound. He was really resurrected. He jumped and rejoiced in his decision until he saw the puffs of smoke ahead. A village appeared before his eyes. Many houses were burning and there were wounded everywhere. He couldn't figure out what this place was. The village resembled a battlefield after a battle. A sharp headache forced an interruption to these musings. Unfamiliar scraps of memories began to surface in my mind. Some of the latest was the news of his mother's illness and the attack on the village. And upon reflection, Jin-Soo thought he might be in the era of the 3 empires. This was the beginning of an unusual journey for the young surgeon. Jin-Soo rushed towards the village and the injured people with all his legs. There were so many injured residents around. They were lying on the ground and houses were burning around them. Jin-Soo ran, and the cries for help and moans of the injured could be heard all around. He looked around and tried to figure out what had happened here. Very close by, he heard a lurching sound. It was one of the injured men. Jin-Soo rushed over to the peasant and tried to examine his wounds. The man, struggling with pain and tears, begged to be saved. The young surgeon wondered what to do. He had no medical gloves or even water to wash his hands. At that moment, he was called by another peasant, calling him a young gentleman. A man ran up and asked if he was okay. Jin-Soo remembered his name. The peasant's name was Wang Sam. When Wang Sam saw the blood on the young man's hands, he was afraid that he was injured, but Jin-Soo assured him that it wasn't him. He asked him to find water, a needle and thread. Wang Sam was surprised by the polite treatment, and he immediately asked why the young man was acting like this. But the young surgeon did not bother to answer the question. There was no time for that now. Wang Sam should have hurried so that Jinsu could provide assistance. He was now out of the hospital and unable to use anesthesia and equipment to monitor the casualty's condition. The surgeon was confused. There was no choice, and it was necessary to check all the wounds. But Jinsu's hands were shaking. He thought with surprise that he was afraid to do so, but the man in front of him needed urgent help. The young surgeon had no time to be afraid now. Gathering himself mentally, he ordered himself to pull himself together. He began to examine the wound. At the same time, Jinsu thought that he needed an assistant and it would be dangerous if the blood blocked the airway. He checked the abdominal aorta and renal artery in turn. They were fine. Moving on, Jinsu made sure that there was also no rupture in the small intestine, but found that there was a wound in the duodenum. That was bad because fecal matter could enter the abdomen. First, he should have cleaned up the stagnant blood. Wang Sam was already carrying a bucket of clean water. The people ran after him. Jinsu thanked him and asked him to bring another piece of clean cloth. The surgeon was handed a needle and thread. The thread was very thick for such an operation. Threading the needle was not easy. Jinsu was nervous because it was like sewing, not surgery. But he had no choice. He couldn't let this man die. As he continued to examine the wound, he blamed the angel for being here and without the right tools. But Jinsu Han had no intention of giving up for nothing. To wash the wound, he used the water Wang Sam brought. After treatment, he was ready to begin suturing the wound. Jinsu stitched stitch by stitch, pulling the edges together. He even praised himself in his mind because he was doing a good job. Finally, the operation was over and he breathed a sigh of relief. But a frightened woman was already running toward him. It was the wife of the wounded man. She rushed to hug him. Jinsu tried to calm the girl down. He said the surgery was successful and the man would survive. Sobbing, the girl couldn't believe that with such an injury it was possible. Continuing to hug her husband, she asked if Jinsu was the healer. He evasively agreed that he was trained in medicine. There were many other wounded people to be rescued. Someone Jinsu was able to help and they should be on the mend. But the wounds of others were too serious for the surgeon to help. But Jinsu was determined. He did everything he could to save someone. After finishing with Wang Sam and Jinsu's help, they walked through the forest and reasoned that the bandits who had committed such atrocities deserved to be punished. The young surgeon suggested that soldiers had probably already been sent out to catch these criminals, but Wang Sam disagreed. He thought the soldiers wouldn't risk their lives to catch them. There were rumors that the soldiers were being bribed. Jinsu couldn't believe his ears. It seemed unbelievable that bandits would bribe the authorities. He was outraged, but what was happening was explained by a historical event called the Yellow Armband Rebellion when the Han dynasty fell. He compiled the facts and concluded that next year there would be a takeover of Manhwa Island. The Yellow Armband Rebellion was to begin the following year. The realization that all of China would be engulfed in battle made his hands tremble and his fists clench. Wang Sam was listening to Jinsu's reasoning and didn't know what he was talking about. They reached home when it was completely dark. Wang Sam advised the young master to take a bath so that the others wouldn't think he was injured. Jinsu agreed and thanked him for his help. As he drew water, he pondered how it had all happened. The young gentleman must have been ambushed on his way back. The one whose body Jinsu's spirit was in had been without his grandfather and father for a long time, and his mother had been seriously ill for the past few months. Then the young man began to study medicine. He had two brothers, the elder Huabok, who was 21 years old, and the 18-year-old Huabun. Jinsu pondered that it would be awkward to call them elders. After all, he was 31 years old. But at that moment, he was called Huaba's name. A young man ran to him. He had heard from Wang Sam that Huabu had met the bandits and was worried about whether his younger brother was okay. Jinsu reassured him that everything was fine, and the young man breathed out a sigh of relief. Huabok told me about his mother's condition. She had recently eaten and fallen asleep. Huabu, as the young man in the new body was now called, decided not to disturb her. He told his older brother he'd see her tomorrow when she woke up. This surprised Huabok. After all, his brother had not been here for a long time. Huabu wanted to be a good son and asked to see his mother. But he was troubled by guilt, for she had only laid down to rest. Huabok pondered his younger brother's words, agreeing that waking her now would be undesirable. Huabok praised Huaba for his thoughtfulness and sent him off to rest after his arduous journey and studies in Seoja. Collapsing on the bed, Huabu decided it had been a momentous day. As he fell asleep, he pondered what he should do next and where he should start. In a dream, he dreamed that an angel reported the complete healing of the body. The rebirth was complete. In the morning, Huabu woke up sleeping full of energy and in a great mood. Pulling himself up, he arched back too far and was surprised by it. After testing his flexibility with various exercises and stretching himself, Huabu got ready for breakfast. Not a single piece of meat was served for breakfast, only vegetables. The family's financial situation was not very good. The young man's body was very thin because his diet consisted mainly of vegetables and greens. Looking at Haobin's brother, who was quite sturdy-looking, Huabu wondered what he was eating. Continuing with breakfast, Huabun asked about yesterday's brigand attack. Huabu replied that he managed to escape in time and was unhurt. My brother said that in addition to studying, we should not forget about physical training and it is useful to learn martial arts. Huabu was going to harden himself from that day forward. He informed his brothers about it. This statement surprised and amused the elders. Huabun didn't understand what happened to the boy who preferred reading books to martial arts. At this, Huabu thought to himself of the young man who had been attacked by robbers and taken his life. Huabok remarked that this must have been the effect of yesterday's attack, and Huabu was still under the impression. Remembering the wounded, Huabu said it was better to concentrate on martial arts. Reading books wouldn't help them escape any faster. Huabun praised his younger brother for his decision to learn how to defend himself. But Huabok remarked that if Huabu became an official, he could hire people trained in martial arts. After finishing their conversation and meal, the brothers went to visit their mother. She was lying in bed and was happy to see Huaba and asked when he had arrived. To make it more comfortable to talk, the woman asked Hei Wool's maid to put a pillow under her back. She was having coughing fits, but she was able to say that the spring festival was coming soon. Seeing Mother Huabu in agony, he rushed to her worriedly. He decided to come as soon as he heard that she was ill, but the woman assured him that there was no reason and that the illness was not so serious that she should drop out of school. Huabu was going to examine the sick woman. The mother said the illness could be from the liver. It could be dangerous. The young man began the examination. Pressing on the abdomen caused painful sensations and the mother's face twisted in pain. Watching her reaction, he was convinced that it was the liver that was causing the illness. Huabun, seeing the mother in pain, rushed to Huab and intercepted his arm. But the young man was very serious and asked to be let go. It was important to complete the inspection. Huabun was not persuaded by the words that Huabu had learned many important things from medical books. He didn't think it was enough to become a healer. Huabok listened to Huabun's indignation. He thought Huaba was inept. Even if he had read all the books in the world, he still couldn't become a healer. Finally, he asked if the younger brother really saved the injured man in the village. Wang Sam told him the story. Huabok told Huabun what Huabu had done and what condition the injured man was in. Huabun was taken aback and asked if it was a joke. He didn't believe it was possible to save a man with such injuries, but Huabu confirmed it. The younger brother clarified that the injured man would be very lucky to survive. His condition was very serious. He said that a man with knowledge of medicine could not stand idly by in such a situation. As long as there was one chance to save his life, he couldn't give up. The brothers thought Huabu sounded like a doctor. Huabu thought he was a doctor who had trained in general surgery for 3 years. After thinking for a moment, Huabok gave permission to finish examining Mother. Huabu continued his examination. He felt his abdomen and checked where the pain was worse. The brothers stood nearby and patiently watched. His stomach and liver were fine, but the whites of the eyes were yellow and another assumption had to be checked. The pressure was very painful. Huabu determined the diagnosis. It was cholecystitis, or inflammation of the gallbladder. The pain was not only on palpation but also reflexive. And thinking that his mother's illness had lasted several months, Huabu was horrified at how hard it had been on her. He was contemplating treatment. In the era he was in, gallbladder surgery was not possible. Mother asked him not to worry too much. She took a decoction prescribed by the local healer and hoped to get well soon. It dawned on Huaba that the disease could be cured by the potion. His mind was filled with a wealth of knowledge gained by the owner of the body. Pondering a cure, he asked Huabok for the prescriptions written by the healer. As his brother looked for the recipes, Huabu was glad he'd saved them. After all, many people simply threw the papers away. After reading one of Huabu's recipes, he was horrified. It was not at all effective in curing, but expensive because of the ginseng it contained. And he explained that the disease started because the gallbladder was filled with solid contents. Huabok had heard about gallstones, but he was surprised that Huabu had only found out by examining him. The older brother believed in the diagnosis, but didn't know how to modify the decoction. To reduce pain, Huabu suggested adding corn tendrils and purple durum. But of course, the best way was to get rid of the stones. This news encouraged Huabun. Huabu firmly promised his brothers to cure Mother. He said that far beyond the Great Wall of China, Western healers had learned to remove the excess. Hearing this, Huabun was indignant. It was unthinkable for him to think of opening his stomach. Huabu had envisioned such a reaction. This era was far removed from such treatments. But the spirit of the young surgeon Jin Su-han was reborn in Huabu's body for a reason, and Huabu was sure that he would definitely save Mother from her illness. To Huabun's objections, he replied that she would surely recover if everything was well treated after the removal of the stones. But Huabun became even more angry and grabbed the young man by the collar. Huabok stopped the brothers' quarrel. He agreed that the healing arts behind the Great Wall of China were truly incredible. But still, he had never heard of a sick person having their stomach cut open. Nor could he allow the thought of such a method of treating their mother. Huabu tried to explain that if left to her own devices, she might not be able to withstand the illness. Enraged by such words, Huabun slapped the young man. And when he called Huabu's words nonsense, the young man tried to fight back. The blow came right to his brother's jaw, and Huabun decided to give his younger brother a good lesson for his inappropriate behavior. Once again, Huabok intervened and stopped the fight breaking out in front of his mother. The patient sitting on the bed watched what was happening. The guilty brothers were ashamed and began to apologize to their mother. So she decided to start the treatment with the potion Huabu had suggested. Then she asked her sons to leave and let her rest. Then the brothers left their mother's room and Huabu carefully covered the doors. As they walked through the yard, he reflected that he was obliged to perform the operation and save his mother. But the situation was complicated by the fact that he didn't even have the necessary tools. He realized that if he left it alone, the irreparable would happen. Thinking that he would conduct the operation in secret since his brothers did not support him, Huabu was startled when they called out to him. Huabun apologized for hitting him. He became so nervous because of his mother's health, which had not improved for a long time. Huabu accepted the apology. He too was at fault and had spoken without thinking. The older brother noticed that the kid's punch was pretty fierce, and Huabu even hit Huabun a little. Since the brothers hadn't seen each other for a long time, Huabu suggested a Sanshu duel. It was called unarmed sparring. But it was not interesting to fight just like that, and the younger brother suggested that in case of losing, a request should be fulfilled. Huabun laughed at the way Huabu was preparing to spar. In the past, on holidays, the younger brother always got a slap from the older brother and lost. Huabu assured him he wasn't worried about it. He wanted to learn martial arts, and Huabun was the most resilient person he knew. The older brother was pleased that Huabu appreciated his fighting prowess and Huabun agreed to spar. The brothers stood against each other. Huabok acted as judge. Huabu decided to attack right away and jumped up throwing a punch. But Huabun was well trained. He made a stand and repelled his brother's attack. From that impact, Huabu traveled quite a distance on the ground. He gradually came to his senses, wondering how this had happened since Huabun hadn't even moved. Huabok calmly watched the fight and how his younger brother was losing. After another blow, Huabu was lying on the ground again. This was not like him at all. Huabun offered his younger brother to surrender. The bet was lost. Huabu disagreed. Then Huabun struck the next blow with his foot. Huabu had already focused and successfully blocked it. He turned his attention to his brother's supporting leg. This was an opportunity to change the course of the fight. Huabu confidently twisted the leg he was blocking, and Huabun lost his balance. Now, the younger brother had the advantage in sparring. But the experienced Huabun, despite lying on the ground, deftly intercepted Huabu's hands. He said he might not use his hands and immediately planted his brother with his foot. Huabun had definitely won now, but he was going to make his request when he had thought about it, and then Huab was going to fulfill it. Resting after sparring, Huabu thought back to the last blow. His stomach ached badly. He also wondered what his brother would ask him to do. In front of Huabu was a lunch that again lacked protein. He couldn't get any better with this diet. But then he restrained himself. The most important thing now was the operation for Mother, and that would require a scalpel, which he hoped to find or ask for. He wanted to determine his blood type with a simple test. But anesthesia was a problem. Even after studying Huabu's memories, he couldn't find a plant that could produce such an anesthetic effect. And he realized that in an era when people are afraid of this kind of treatment, he needed someone to help him. Huabu decided to proceed in order and start with what was more feasible. First, instead of a scalpel, make a knife. But that required money, and Jinsu had the money of his time when he was transferred. It wasn't suitable for payment in this time. Then Huabu decided to go to one of his older brothers. He went to Huabok. After getting some pocket money, the young man went to the market. He looked around for his favorite mandu dish, but it was nowhere to be seen. And when he asked the merchants, they were very surprised. No one had heard of this dish. Huabu was surprised. Mandu was considered a traditional Chinese dish. It was invented by Zhu Ge Liang to comfort the souls of people who died in the war. That's when he realized that the pussy hadn't been invented yet. Huab wanted meat. Since he had come to this time, he had eaten nothing but vegetables, greens, and rice. While walking around the market, the young man came across a healer's shop. Stepping inside, Huabu asked if anyone was there. He looked at the shelves of herbs and roots. He had already ordered the knife from the forge. The anesthesia remained. Huabu asked the healer if there was a temporarily paralyzing herb. It was a property of poisons, but the shop didn't use them because it was dangerous. The man sitting on the bench asked Huabu how much he needed. The young man thought about it. He had to determine the optimal dosage and identify side effects. He also needed mice for experiments. He said he needed some but different herbs. In the future, Huabu wanted to look for the herbs himself. They began to haggle. Huabu voiced the final cost of 1 nan for 2 jian. The man raised the price to 2.5 nannies and promised to go searching tomorrow and give the plants to Huab after tomorrow. Huabu went in search of mice for experiments. He wandered into a slum, or what they called a poor man's village. There was a terrible odor in this village. It was rumored that starvation was killing several people a day. The atmosphere around him was depressing. It was worse than Huabu had imagined. He turned his attention to the noise and the crowd nearby. As he pushed people away, he saw a man lying on the ground with an injured leg. Perhaps he had fallen from a tree while picking apricots. When asked who he was, Huabu introduced himself as a healer and asked to let him examine the leg of the injured man. The man was in severe pain during the examination. Huabu realized the bone was broken but could not ascertain the shape of the fracture. He also did not know if the bone fragments had damaged ligaments and connective tissue. He dressed the wound using improvised means to stop the bleeding. After that, Huabu continued to probe his leg. He didn't know if he could help the man, but he looked at the sobbing child and made a decision. Huabu turned to the gawkers crowded around and asked them to bring ice water and rags. People froze, not knowing where to find ice water. There were no refrigerators in those days. The man's son asked if the water from the well would work. This satisfied the young healer, but he also asked for some wood to fix his leg. In a hurry to help his father, the little boy rushed to fulfill his errand. Seeing that the bleeding had stopped, Huabu decided to take a closer look at the leg. The inside of the tibia was quite swollen. This meant that the bone had damaged the ligaments and connective tissue after all. But there was still a chance that Huabu was wrong. On the other hand, the leg muscles were intact. Suddenly, it was like seeing through an X-ray to see a broken bone. Huabu was stunned in amazement. He could see through objects and could not understand what was happening. But after a while, everything he saw inside began to fade away. He had to hurry. He turned to the men to hold the injured man while the healer put the bones back together. The procedure was very painful and required the assistance of several men. Finally, the bones were joined, but the X-ray vision disappeared faster than Huabu finished. He hoped he had done the right thing. At that time, the child had just brought water. He was worried that his father was all right. Huabu replied that everything was fine and the man passed out from the pain. It was even better for him now. The only thing left to do was to sew up the wound. The villagers watched fearfully. They had never seen wounds treated in this way before. When Huabu finished, he thought he would definitely need anesthesia in the future, and the villagers marveled at his treatment. An old man with a crutch couldn't walk normally for the rest of his life because the fracture hadn't healed properly. He appreciated Huabu's youth and talent. The villagers inquired why the healer had come to their village. Huabu immediately thought of mice or rats and wondered if he could buy them here. People asked why he wanted them and how many he needed. Huabu patiently replied that he would use them for work and needed 20. One of the villagers remarked that it is not easy but possible to get such a quantity. While the man was clarifying the price, the son of the patient volunteered to catch mice for Huabu in return for a reduction in the cost of treatment. Though the healer didn't plan to take money, he accepted the child's offer. The baby promised to be done in 4 days. Before leaving, Huabu explained to the child how to care for his father. The child was encouraged and promised to follow all the recommendations. On the way back, the young man picked up a knife that was already ready. Of course, it was thicker than a scalpel, but since there were no other options, Huabu was going to use it for the first time. Instead of disinfectant, he was going to buy alcohol. To do so, he went to Kisan's house and was surprised to find no visitors there. In the arbor at this time, a servant girl was being punished. It was one of the clients who was unhappy with the way she was handling it. An employee of the house offered to bring another maid, for which he was slapped. The client was angry that the servants didn't know their place. The offended worker was about to pull out his sword but was stopped by his partner. The client became even more enraged. He started looking for the dagger, and snatching it from under his clothes, he rushed at the workers. The blade cut the skin on the cheek of the servant who had not had time to draw his sword. Unable to bear such treatment, he drew his weapon and knocked the knife out of the client's hands. The man tried to intimidate him with his status, but the man kicked that client out anyway. Huabu caught that moment and thought that in this era, everything was decided with weapons. Seeing the wound on the employee's face, he offered to help, but he refused. Huabu was too young for his looks. Before he left, the healer said he wanted to buy some hard liquor here. The maid advised him to go to the inn. It was impossible to buy it separately at Kisan's house. Huabu heeded the advice and went on to purchase a disinfectant. After the purchase, he heard a conversation on the street. It was an employee of the Kisan house. The wounded man would not stop bleeding. They sent a man to fetch the healer, but he was still missing. Huabu hesitated to offer his help. The man had already rejected her once. When the second worker heard the noise and saw the young man, he asked him to help his brother. Huabu was about to leave, but now he had no choice. The man explained that the healer Bon had gone to another village for a checkup and would not be back soon, and the brother's blood wouldn't stop. It didn't seem very ethical for Huab to treat a sick person in the shop of an absent healer. The man offered to take his brother outside, but the young man still refused. Then he fell to his knees in front of Huabu, begging to save his brother and apologizing for his past rudeness. Huabu warned that he was only an apprentice, and it had been a long time, so he could not guarantee a successful outcome. But as soon as they proceeded to the shop, the healer Bon returned. The man who had persuaded Huaba to help immediately began showing his injured brother to the healer. Then the young man decided to stay and observe how the treatment would go. Examining the wound, healer Bon thought that the largest vein in his face had been cut. He wanted to use acupuncture to stop the bleeding, which perplexed Huaba. Bon prepared the tools to begin the procedure. Huabu had never heard of this way of stopping blood before. He watched. The bleeding decreased. The healer managed to stimulate the nerve bundle with the needle, causing the muscles to expand and squeeze the vessels. Huabu came to the conclusion that acupuncture was based on medical knowledge. He didn't realize it when he was studying. After the healer finished, Bon dressed the wound and said he had done all he could. But he warned me that he had to get the needle out in a quarter of an hour, and there was no guarantee he wouldn't bleed again. The wounded man's brother asked if the needle could be left in for longer, but in this case, the man could lose either his voice or his sight. The man was desperate. Huabu did not leave and continued to watch. He realized the acupuncture was a temporary fix. The vessels needed to be rejoined, but the young man couldn't interfere with someone else's work. Just at that moment, the Bon healer turned to him and asked who he was. Huabu introduced himself as a student of medicine and said he had studied many books and sometimes practiced the healing arts. Bon hummed and called the young man a green doctor. But Huabu asked permission to connect the wounded man's blood vessels. The doctor wondered how Huabu knew about the vein injury, but since the chances of recovery were slim, he allowed him to operate. The young man prepared his needle. He had to hurry because there was no anesthesia, and the needle was not quite suitable for connecting the vessels. Healer Bon helped take away the pain with another needle. He was surprised that Huabu didn't know the basics of acupuncture. The young man asked the healer to assist and clamp the vein while connecting the vessel. Finally, the surgery was over and Huabu exhaled. He made recommendations for treatment and care. Healer Bon was delighted with the method. Outside, the brothers thanked the healers for their help and all began to say goodbye. The healer Bon looked at the men as they departed. He thought the wounded man would be crippled or worse. But Huabu interrupted his musings by saying that he wanted to learn from him. Bon agreed on the condition that Huabu teach him the technique of sewing vessels and flesh together. Huabok and Huabun were at home discussing that Huabu's recipe was better than the healer's. Mother felt better and even went for a walk. They also reasoned that it was time for the younger brother to return to his studies and should be trained in the art of the sword. At that moment, a belated Huabu burst into the room. Seeing the bloodstains on his clothes made the brothers nervous. Huab had to explain that it wasn't his blood, and he and healer Bon were treating a man with a cut on his face. Huabok asked if the younger brother wanted to become a famous healer and become famous. Huabu replied that it didn't matter, and he wanted to find a cure for Mother. But Huabok said he didn't have to worry about that because he wasn't a healer, even if the potion helped. Huabun changed the subject and uplifted the younger Arat's spirits by rejoicing that his mother's health had improved, and added that he was going to teach Huaba the art of the sword. Following Huabun, the young man pondered that it would not be unreasonable. He didn't know this world. His older brother tossed him a training safety vest. He planned to start training immediately. Huabu asked his brother to put on protection as well. That would be fair. But Huabun only laughed in response. He was only willing to wear it if Huabu could hit him. The brothers armed themselves with practice swords and stood opposite each other. Huabun gave his younger brother a chance to strike first. Huabu was confident in his abilities. Even if he wasn't a swordsman, the kendo knowledge he had gained in his past life would help him. Grabbing the sword with both hands, he jumped up, attacking his brother. But before he could even touch, Huabun received a punch to the stomach. The older brother was experienced and trained. He easily parried the attack. As Huabu came to his senses, Huabu noticed that he was too slow and didn't need to swing so hard. The young man thought he'd hit his older brother a little hard after all, and wondered why he was so fast. Huabu was going to use a swordsmanship technique in his next attack. His speed should have allowed him to get his brother the first time. But Huabun, though surprised, was able to parry this strike as well. And Huabu failed again by flying aside and dropping his training sword. Huabun wondered who had taught his brother martial arts in Shuzhou. Huabu stood up and was ready to try again, but his older brother said it was pointless. He realized that the younger one had no fighting skills and needed to start from the basics. The brothers proceeded into the courtyard and Huabun pointed to a suspended stone. Huabu's task was to hit that rock. Looking at the target, he thought it was too easy, but it turns out the distance to the rock should have been greater. Hua-Boon demonstrated what this attack was supposed to look like. He reached the rock the first time and from just as great a distance. Hua-Bu watched the lunge with his mouth open in amazement. The older brother noticed that it was now the young man's turn to strike. Hua-Bu was confused. The stone was rocking from the last hit and he wanted to stop it. But Hua-Boon disagreed. The enemy never waited for an attack, and his younger brother had a moving target to hit. Hua-Bu focused and jumped, aiming to hit the rock. The stone was spinning and he couldn't manage to touch it. Hua-Boon left his brother to practice until he had 3 successful attempts out of 10. Trying again and again, Hua-Bu was exhausted but couldn't even hit 3 times out of 100. The thought of giving up martial arts and focusing on medicine even crossed his mind. But memories of the previous host's demise drove that thought away. He couldn't die again and went through a lot to become a doctor. With these thoughts, he continued trying to reach the rock. In the morning, Hua-Boon headed for the suspended stone, wondering if Hua-Bu had succeeded in retrieving it. As he got closer, he saw a practice pit on the ground. Then he noticed that there were 3 stones tied to the branch. This puzzled him, and Hua-Bu was waking up after his grueling workout the day before. He was surprised to find how his muscles had strengthened and couldn't believe it was after just one workout. Coming to the conclusion that it was a miracle of rebirth, he remembered to go to the healer Bon. Bon was already waiting for the late young man. He even ordered needles from the blacksmith in advance. Before Hua-Bu came, he had been practicing stitching up animal wounds, but couldn't even handle a pig's vessel that was thicker than a human's. When Hua-Bu arrived, the healer rushed over to meet him, wondering if he had eaten lunch. Bon suggested that the young man go and get something to eat together. Hua-Bu enjoyed meat. He hadn't eaten since his rebirth. While the young man ate, Bon showed the needle he had ordered from the blacksmith. The young man looked at the instrument in amazement. The needle was quite well made. Hua-Bu concluded that it was possible to make the tools he needed in this era after all. The physician said it was made in the smelter at the magistracy. It was used to make weapons for the soldiers. Hua-Bu rushed to draw the tools that needed to be made. After drawing them, he began to explain what they were used for. But Bon said they would be very difficult to make and he couldn't guarantee it. Having had enough, Hua-Bu exhaled contentedly, and the healer wanted to just show him something. And he showed the young man the pig's vessels on which he had practiced suturing. Studying the healer's work, Hua-Bu explained that blood moved in certain directions, and they had to be determined. But he praised Bon for the work he had done. And to make it clearer to the healer, I showed him an example of how to connect the vessels. A man came into the shop. He brought what Bon had ordered earlier. It was a small model of a man. On the layout, he began to show the main acupuncture points, explaining their purpose. Hua-Bu checked to see if all the points were on the layout. There were all the points known to the Bon healer. A map of acupuncture points surfaced in the young man's subconscious. It wasn't just like a memory, it was like a picture from a book. The healer noticed that his apprentice was distracted and thinking about something. To get Hua-Bu's attention back, he had to pound his fist on the table. The healer demanded that the young man recount what was said about the Min-Men point. Hua-Bu started to answer, and the picture from the textbook popped up in front of his eyes again. And the young man once again thought about formulating the correct answer. This attitude made the healer Bon mad. He decided that Hua-Bu was not yet ready to learn from him. The young man tried to change his mind, and Bon was ready to test his attitude toward his studies. He instructed Hua-Bu to bring a collection of acupuncture books from the room. Healer Bon then said that he would give the young man 3 days to study these books, and only then would they continue their acupuncture training. Hua-Bu stared dazedly at the stack of books, but had no choice but to agree. The healer himself was going to practice stitching vessels during those 3 days. They said their goodbyes and Hua-Bu ran home as fast as he could. He was already late. Hua-Bu was already waiting for him in the courtyard. The young man said that he was late because of the healer's lessons. The elder brother was not opposed to Hua-Bu becoming a healer, but he still had to convince Mother and Haobak. Hua-Bu wondered how many times his brother had managed to hit the rock yesterday. Hua-Bu proudly replied that he had hit the target 10 times. His brother did not believe in such a result, but the young man promised to demonstrate after reading the books. Hua-Bu studied the books carefully. He wanted to find the point responsible for his mother's illness. And then, the young man discovered that some of the points were not in the book. Perhaps they hadn't been discovered yet. Then he decided to systematize everything and compare the points he knew with those of this era. But to prevent others from understanding what he was doing, Hua-Bu used Hangul. This alphabet wouldn't be invented until 1,200 years later. Finally, the work was finished, and the young surgeon looked at his creation with pride. At dinner, Haobak wondered why Hua-Bu had skipped lunch. After learning that the reason was acupuncture books, the older brother skeptically asked if Hua-Bu was going to become a healer. But when Haobak heard that his younger brother was serious about studying medicine, he was angry. This is not why they sent him to study in Shuzhou. His brother wanted to see Hua-Bu as a high-ranking dignitary who could help the emperor with his wisdom. But the young man pointed out that his brother, his father, and even his grandfather had not been able to obtain positions after passing the exams. The brother was astonished at this impertinence. This was because Hwabok was a kind and honest man and did not pay bribes to get a position. But Hwabu also considered himself a person. Having said all this, the young man left the table. Hwabun hurried after his younger brother, leaving Hwabok alone. The brothers arrived at practice on the way, discussing what had happened over dinner. In the backyard, Hwabu was able to show how he learned how to hit a rock. Hwabun was pleased with the result. He recognized that his younger brother was not only good at studying books, but also at martial arts. This time, it was to practice on 6 stones. Hwabun called for scrutiny and began to show the punches. When he finished, he told Hwab to train hard. If he could do the same, the bandits would not be able to hurt him. But Hwabun was also going to show how to block a punch. He commanded his younger brother to attack first. Hwabu attacked, trying to hit Hwabun. He had practiced hard before and hoped it would work. But Big Brother was fast and dodged the practice sword. If he couldn't dodge in time, he blocked the blow with his sword. After many failed attempts, Hwabu decided to keep his distance and look for a gap where he could strike. But even at a distance, Hwabun was more experienced. He struck, and if it had been a real sword, Hwabu would have been defeated. The older brother noticed that the young man seemed to be reading his movements, and it was amazing. Training was over for the day. In the morning, Hwab had to go to the market. That same evening, the healer Bon went to the blacksmith. The latter was pleased to see the guest and kindly offered to give him tea. The healer agreed and asked the blacksmith to make the tools Hwabu had drawn. Bon explained that these items the young healer was going to use for healing. In the morning, Hwab was delivered the poisonous plants he had collected to his order. For everything, the man asked for 2 sitters and told the names of the plants. Hwabu thanked and paid even a large amount, promising to definitely contact them if he needed anything else. There were enough plants to experiment with, and the young man could finally anesthetize. After receiving the plants, Hwabu went to get the next order. He came to the house of a man with a broken leg in a poor man's village. The man apologized. Hwab had to come to his house and see this poverty. On the table was a cage full of rats that the man's son had promised to catch. There were quite a few of them. Hwabu asked the sick man how his leg was. It seemed to be fine. But the young healer asked permission to examine the limb and remove the bandages. Since the wound had not been treated, it had festered. To disinfect his leg, Hwabu pulled out a bottle of strong drink. The man was very excited when he saw the alcohol and said he couldn't help himself at the sight of it. But Hwabu explained what he would use it for and dampened the cloth with the liquid. The man still wanted to consume the leftovers if there were any. The physician left it to the patient's discretion, but ominously warned that he might lose a limb if he did. Finished with his inspection, Hwabu went to see the rats. For some unknown reason, he had a headache. He tried to give the rats poison with sticks, but they avoided the poison. The experiment lacked a syringe. When the patient asked why he was doing it, Hwabu shared his idea. He asked if he knew someone who knew about poisonous herbs. The man himself knew about plants, but he didn't know if there was such an herb that would help him wake up after fainting. The sick man's son peeked into the room. Seeing the young healer, he was a little surprised. Hwabu handed the boy a disinfectant. The child was worried that his father might drink it, but the healer again reminded the man of the consequences, and he promised not to touch the drink. After that, Hwabu offered the boy to work with him. The child's name was Obo. Obo escorted the healer to an empty house nearby. The boy said that his grandmother and granddaughter lived here. When the grandmother was gone, the girl went to Kaisen's house, and the house was empty. Hwabu is once again convinced he's fallen on hard times. Now this house could be used for experiments. Watching the animals, Hwabu pondered how to feed them the poisoned grain. The rats had well-developed instincts and were in no hurry to eat it, so they decided to put the grains directly into the rats' mouths. Hwabu held the animal and Obo tried to push the poison in. 5 grains turned out to have too much poison, and they decided to try again with less. But the poison content was still high. Hwabu concluded that 2 poisonous grains is a semi-lethal dose. Since this process took quite a bit of time, the healer asked the boy to stay and observe the animals. But Obo needed to labor in the morning, and Hwabu gave him 5 nannies to keep him from going to another job. For a boy, such a sum was a lot of money. But Hwab needed to go, and he went on his way. The young man returned home, and there waiting for him was Hwabun, ready for new training. To objections that he was tired, the older brother replied that it was no hindrance. They stood against each other armed with wooden practice swords. Today, Hwab was to defend, and Hwabun was to attack. The older brother made a very fast jump, intending to hit the opponent. But despite his agility and skill, Hwabun couldn't reach Hwabu. A stunned Hwabun noticed that his younger brother was able to block the blow. He couldn't imagine Huabu using the power of inner chi to do that. It was also called spiritual energy, but Huabu knew nothing about it and asked for more details. But when asked, Huabun replied that they would talk later. After all, the training wasn't over yet, and that was more important. Huabu demanded of his brother to tell him about the inner chi, if he was able to block the blow. Huabun laughed at such insolence and struck again. But Mdad brother blocked him again this time too. Huabun wondered how the rookie beginner managed to block 2 punches in a row. Huabu clearly had the ability. Huabun himself had spent several years of training on such blocking. His older brother called Huabu over to the Red Rhino Inn for a snack. They hadn't gone out together since Huabu had arrived. When asked what he wanted to eat, his younger brother said that just noodles would do. But Huabun replied that they should eat meat. They ordered a lot of food and wine. The latter was to be kept secret from Halbuk. Huabu was about to make a toast. Huabun hadn't even heard that term before. Junior gave a speech and explained how the drink should be consumed after the toast. But a fight was breaking out in the center of the inn, which distracted the brothers from their meal. 2 men fought violently over a girl who asked them to stop. Huabu watched, not seeing anything wrong with this fight until one of the punches hit a life-threatening spot. From such a blow, the man lost consciousness, but the other did not even notice it, continuing to ask questions. Finally, he saw that the enemy was not moving or reacting. The attacker was afraid that he had taken his life and ran away. The girl was crying next to the victim. Halbun didn't believe the man could be disabled so easily, but Huabu decided to examine him. Not listening to his older brother's protests, he walked over and asked for permission to look around. The man was not breathing and there was no pulse on his neck. Huabu thought it might have been cardiac arrest. He was going to do everything he knew how to do to save this man. First, he needed to clear his airway, and then do CPR. Huabu tried his best. The man was too young for such an end. The young man began CPR. The people around me watched in horror. At that time, such a way to resume breathing had not yet been invented. They called for the healer to stop thinking that the man's spirit had already left this world. Even Huabun tried to stop his younger brother. But Huabu was hitting his ribcage trying to start the man's heart. And it worked. The victim regained consciousness. All the people watching in amazement gasped. They cheered and praised the young healer who had brought the man back to life. Huabu was coming around and the man couldn't understand what had happened. He looked around for his adversary until the girl said he'd run off thinking the man wasn't breathing. The news that he had almost left this world discouraged the victim. Huabu confirmed this and advised resting and staying still to regain his strength. The man asked how the young healer managed to save him. While he was trying to explain, the victim got a headache. It was the effects of cardiac arrest and he didn't need to move. In parting, the man wanted to thank Huaba for saving his life. The one appreciated the clothes and jewelry and decided to accept the thanks. The afflicted man held out 1 liang of silver to the young healer. The brothers looked at the offering in amazement. It was a great deal. The man was grateful for his life and he didn't feel sorry for those coins. At that moment, the male assailant came running in. He brought a healer with him. Seeing each other, the friends rushed to find out about each other again. And the brothers tried not to watch them with undue curiosity. The healer was checking the man's condition, and the girl told him that Huabu had saved him. Huabun excitedly recognized that his younger brother had become an incredible healer. At this point, their friends came up to them again and started thanking them. The attacker was Zhang Pan of the merchant militia, and in gratitude for saving his friend's life, he also held out the silver. Huabu tried to refuse since he had already received thanks, but Zhang Pan insisted, and the young healer had to accept that silver too. Finally, everyone said their goodbyes and went about their business. Huaba was called out by a healer who had been summoned to help. He asked how the young man managed to save the young man's life. Huabu wondered how the healer was able to determine that the man had been saved just by his pulse, but still tried to explain his actions. The young man said that he had learned this technique on his own during his studies, which caused the healer to be quite surprised. Huabu tried to explain that he had created the technique based on folk medicine. He could not say that he had studied it in the future. The healer belatedly introduced himself. His name was Seok Pil. He began to extol Huabu's skill at such a young age. He then asked the young man to teach him cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Huabun watched this dialogue and his younger brother with pride. In order for Huabu to train him, Sokpil offered to pay 10 liang of silver. Huabu didn't know what to do. He needed money, but this was an easy way to get it. But by learning the technique, the healer could save people. The young man refused the money and called Sokpal the next day to the shop of the healer Bong. Everyone dispersed and Huabu was able to return to his brother's table to continue the meal. Huabun expressed his admiration because his younger brother was going to have experienced healers studying under him. The next day, Huabu went on business again. As he approached the poor man's village, he pondered how the rat experiment had gone. When he arrived at Obo's house, he inquired about his father's well-being. Huabu couldn't find the boy, and the father replied that he had gone out for a while to the place where he worked yesterday. The young healer was pleased with the child's diligence, but now he had to examine the sick man's leg. The disinfection helped, and the wound was healing as it should. The boy's father remembered that Bo had asked him to give something to Hwab. A rat that ate one grain only survived for 3 hours. That was a problem for the young healer. Hwabu bandaged his leg and promised to come back next time. A young man came to the house for experiments and pondered how to reduce the dose of poison. There were few materials for this purpose, but there was no other way out of the 5 animals. Only one rat remained. Bo had just returned and retold the story of the last rat that ate the grain. Hwabu noticed that the boy had brought a basket of grass and wondered what it was. It was hemp. Its stalks were used to make clothes and soup for stomach aches. The healer rushed to the basket. He seemed to have found a solution to the problem. This plant was high in tetrahydrocannabinol, and it could have helped create anesthesia. Hwabu turned the plant into powder and continued the experiment with the rats. The animal that was fed the experimental substance did not respond to external stimuli. Hwabu listened and found that the animal was breathing. Bo watched the healer and asked what he was going to do. In order to test how strong the anesthesia was, Hwab needed to perform surgery. Bo watched the surgeon's actions mesmerized. Meanwhile, Hwabu completed the surgery and sewed up the wound on the rat's stomach. He breathed a sigh of relief because the work was finished, and the boy was worried about the animal. Now they had to wait for the rat to wake up. 2 hours later, the animal regained consciousness from the anesthesia. This experiment needed to be done about 10 more times, and that required a lot of rats. Hwabu was going to pay for all the animals Bo would catch. A child at the door of the house heard that. The Mina girl asked if Hwabu was a healer. The man answered in the affirmative. Suddenly, she cried and asked for her mom to be healed. She was willing to do whatever it took. The girl could sew and do laundry. Hwabu asked the girl to bring the sick one to him. When she arrived, the young man performed an examination. The woman had a slight cough, but it was not inflammatory. The problem was a general weakness. The woman had very thin arms. As a treatment, he prescribed to eat well for 2 months and gave the patient a liang of silver. Min-ah cried again, this time out of gratitude. Then they said their goodbyes, and Hwabu and Bo escorted the unexpected visitors out. Bo was sure that Hwabu would help the girl and her mom and was very happy about it. But Hwabu was tired. It was a difficult time and he needed independence. He voiced his displeasure, glad that at least there were no hostilities here. But the boy immediately resented it. He liked this world. And in the future, he wanted to become a healer like Hwaba. And when there were more such healers, the world would change for the better. The young man called Bo a dreamer, but he also wanted the world to be a better place. Then Hwabu offered the boy to be his assistant. The child immediately agreed, happily jumping up and down. First, they had to go to the hemp field, but according to Bo, it was quite far away. It was his first assignment as an assistant healer, and they were on their way. Just before he exited, Bo crashed into Hwaba, who was frozen on the threshold. In front of the house was a huge crowd of people fielding requests for healing. Then Hwabu rolled up his sleeves and asked Bo why he wasn't seeing patients yet. The young surgeon immediately began examining sick people. The little helper tried to help him. He carried water and changed rags. But the boy from fatigue once even dropped the bowl. Visitors would come to the healer until the sun went down. Finally, when everyone had dispersed, Bo exhaled a sigh of relief. He thanked Hwaba enthusiastically for his help, but he had already picked up the basket and was about to head out to the field even though it was already dark. In a wealthy house, a dinner gentleman was told how an unknown healer had resurrected a man. This gentleman was General Cao Ren. He believed that if the rumors were true, a reborn celestial had set foot on their land. The next day at the healer's shop, Bong Hwabu was already telling him and Seok Pil the basics of resuscitation and vascular stitching. The healers prepared money and jewelry as a token of their gratitude. At that moment, they were interrupted. A military officer came in. Hwabu immediately thought something had happened in the army. The military man ran into the shop. He needed the help of the healer Bon. He said that many soldiers were wounded during the clearing of the bandits' den. They had to hurry. The healers didn't hesitate to grab what they needed and hit the road. Hwabu asked permission to go with them. For the healers, it was a good opportunity to see Hwabu's healing arts. Together, they all advanced to the military camp that was located in the Musk Gorge. Hwabu didn't see any seriously injured people. There were soldiers around with only bruises and abrasions. Suddenly, he heard moans and screams coming from the tent. Looking inside, he saw that it was filled with injured warriors. Following Hwabu into the tent was the healer Bon. Seok Pil came up and suggested we start examining the other patients, but Hwabu refused. The first priority was to examine those in greater danger. Seok Pil thought these patients didn't stand a chance. Hwaba was grabbed by the leg by a soldier pierced by an arrow. He asked me to save him. The young surgeon examined the wounded man. The wound was penetrating and an X-ray was necessary for successful treatment. And like the last time he had it, it suddenly appeared. He looked at the victim as if through an X-ray. The arrow grazed the intestine and an abdominal autopsy was necessary. The soldier turned to Hwab again with the words that he wanted to live. The young man took the injured man's hand in his own and promised to save him. After preparing the area for the operation, Hwabu took his pulse. The senior healers watched his actions. They froze in surprise when the young healer said he was going to cut into the patient's abdomen. With his new scalpel, Hwabu did not hesitate to make an incision in the skin. His target was an arrowhead. When he searched the cavity, he found it. Seok Pil watched Hwabu's actions and wondered how he dared to cut into the stomach of a sick man. The next step was to sew up the incision. When the healers heard this, they were even more surprised. Hwabu began handing out commands to the healers as assistants. They put on their masks and were determined to help the young surgeon. Hwabu's mind was all about saving that wounded soldier. The victim was unconscious, and the healers proceeded with the operation. Hwabu stitched and tightened the wound with careful stitches. Senior healers were amazed at his skills and wondered how an ordinary man could possess such knowledge and skills. Finally, the operation came to an end, and Hwabu threw back the needle. He exhaled a sigh of relief and washed his hands thoroughly. Hwabu sincerely thanked his senior colleagues. Thanks to them, he managed with ease. The healers, however, were greatly impressed and intended to learn from the young man at all costs. All three of them were determined to save the rest of the wounded. Meanwhile, soldiers were moving along the dark road. The commander Chao Ren led the soldiers. One of the wagons contained a wounded man. Dezenik Im was wounded by one of the attacking brigands. Looking at the wound, the warlord thought the healer would have a hard time. At last, the detachment reached the camp, where at this time the healers were rescuing wounded soldiers. Seeing the soldiers in the street, the commander lost his temper. He began shouting angrily at the offending subordinates. One of the soldiers hurriedly explained that they were all in line to be examined by a healer. He said it was the same young healer reported last time. Now he saved a soldier dying from an arrow. The warlord remembered the previous conversation and how he had called Hwaba a celestial. And if this talented healer is really here, there's hope that Tensor Im will survive. He immediately gave orders to carry the wounded man to the tent. The soldier was put on a stretcher and was unconscious. The warlord burst into the tent in search of a healer. He was followed by soldiers who held the stretcher with the wounded man. All three healers froze, wondering what Cao Ren was doing here. Senior colleagues rushed to the warlord with greetings and questions as to what had brought him. Hwabu couldn't believe his eyes. From his past life, he knew of this great man. The young man hastened to introduce himself as custom suggested. Cao Ren was stunned at the young age of the healer who was so rumored. But pointing to the wounded 10th man, he asked if Hwabu could heal him. He needed to examine his wounds first, and the young man strode resolutely past the warlord. On examination, he noted that the femoral artery was intact, and as long as the wound did not bleed, it was safe. Cao Ren repeated his question again, to which Hwabu replied that the wound was severe, but there was hope. The commander once again asked, again and again receiving an affirmative answer, asked the healer to start as soon as possible. But Hwabu had already taken off his mask and said he'd do this one when it was his turn. An indignant Cao Ren grabbed the young man's shoulder, trying to stop him and demanding an explanation. Hwabu replied that this patient didn't need emergency treatment, but while he was treating him, someone else would get hurt. And he asked the commander if it was up to him to decide which soldiers would recover and which would not. Dropping his hand from Hwabu's shoulder, he asked Cao Ren to leave. He needed to save the next person. A soldier burst into the tent. He shouted that the bandits had attacked again and taken the women and children with them. The warlord left the tent with the words that Hwab would have to save at least one more person. The young man was determined and was already tying his mask for the next operation. The senior healers were horrified by the tone of Hwabu's conversation with Chao Zheng. They were afraid that he might take their lives. The colonel's father's name was Colonel Chang Shui. He was one of the commanders of the Northern Army, and ordinary people couldn't even get close to him. But Hwabu was beginning to get angry and suggested that he kick one of them out. The healers were frightened into silence. In the village, the liberated thanked the commander and his detachment. All around, houses were burning and wounded people were lying wounded. One of the soldiers reported that the troops sent to subdue the bandits had returned. Cao Ren gave the order to hurry up. They needed to return before dawn. Suddenly, he was pierced by pain. He didn't realize he'd been shot. In the darkness, he came across spikes scattered by the bandits. Cao Ren told the soldiers that it was just a scratch and not to worry. In the tent, Hwabu took turns examining the wounded, and now the soldiers with severe injuries were finally over. The tired healers sat down to rest. They cured many people. But Hwabu wasn't going to stop. They were to examine the people outside. The returning colonel had his leg treated and bandaged. The personal healer warned me to be careful as the wound came from an iron spike. Cao Ren let go of the healer and began to reassure himself that it was a small scratch and everything would be fine. All he was afraid of was getting sick from the iron poison. That's what they called blood poisoning and infection back then. Huabu at this time was worried about the possibility of tetanus. Penicillin could have solved the problem, but it had not yet been invented at that time, so they had to use green mold, which was an unprocessed raw material. In the tent with the sick, the young man urged everyone to listen to him. Those who had been hurt by iron should be careful because there could be iron poison. The wounded panicked in those days. There was no cure and the infection could spread quickly. And he said they should take 1 cup a day when the green mold appears on the maiju. That's the name of the wine made from the milk of a mare. The soldiers started asking each other if they had maiju. Some were afraid it would give them stomach aches. But Huabu threatened that if they didn't take it, the limbs would start getting infected, and he would have to strip them of their soldiers. Warlord Cao Ren was outside and heard the young healer's recommendations. Bursting into the tent, he asked if everything that had just been said was true. Following the healers, Cao Ren asked again if it was true that Maiyuju helped against iron poison. Huabu replied that this drink could prevent tetanus to some extent. The commander turned to the healer Bon to ask if these words were true. Bon replied that he didn't know that, but given Huabu's wisdom, the maiju should be effective. Then the general asked if he would get sick from eating the tainted food. Perhaps majuju will prevent tetanus but cause other diseases. Huabu replied that tetanus is not easily cured. Maiyuju simply increased the chances of not getting sick. And if there was any chance of avoiding tetanus infection, the young healer would prescribe even a poisonous decoction. In response to these words, the commander turned around and left the tent. Huabu had seen people react this way before and had doubts. In a hurry to dispel them, he called out to Cao Zheng and boldly asked if iron poison was spreading through his body. Huabu remembered that in his past life he had encountered sick people who didn't want their illness to be known. They hid it for a variety of reasons, some out of shyness, others to avoid being recognized by acquaintances. Guessing that Cao Ren was not telling the second reason, Huabu asked if the warlord's acquaintance was suffering from iron poison. Cao Ren looked at the sky and finally admitted that his brother was in a critical condition for this reason. Not too long ago, he had to have his ankle amputated. Huabu presented this horrible surgery which unfortunately was ineffective. Before it became dangerous, we had to remove most of the limb. But these words so enraged the warlord that he smashed the wooden fence. His hand was shaking with anger. His brother was being treated by the best healer they knew. Cao Ren asked Huaba to stop jumping to conclusions and just do his job. The young man futilely tried to object. Realizing it was useless to argue now, he agreed and followed back. The warlord also proceeded to the tent with the wounded. Watching the soldiers, he was amazed at how many people Huabu had saved. Despite his youth, the healer had excellent skills. Among the wounded, he saw Tencent Wu and lowered himself down beside him. Cao Ren wondered how the healer had managed to save him. After all, he had seen with his own eyes how the bandit had stabbed him in the stomach. Upon noticing the warlord, the 10th man tried to stand up to greet him. Cao Ren asked the soldier standing next to him if he had really been saved by Huabu's healer and received an affirmative answer. The soldier also added that the young healer saved those who had wounds from the sword of a spear or axe. The warlord thought Huabu was much better than he'd realized at first, and his medical skill is unimaginable. But will the young healer be able to cure his brother? A few days later, in the poor man's village, Huabu was again engaged in experiments. He introduced mold grown on medicinal herbs into the cheese and was eager to see it in the dairy product. And when he broke the cheese, he saw that the inside was moldy. Assistant Bo wondered why the healer had ruined such an expensive product. Huabu replied that this mold is supposed to save people. He already had a plan in his head to cultivate, refine, and harvest this mold. He was thrilled that he could soon get gram-positive bacteria. But there was always the possibility that the patient could refuse treatment. In the warlord's home, his older marriage was tormented by pains caused by an infection. Cao Ren heard the screams from the room but was powerless. After the patient drank moldy maiju for a few days, his condition improved. But he wasn't completely cured yet. The medicine didn't completely eliminate the disease. The warlord's mother ordered that a song healer be invited to visit her sick brother. Cao Ren was skeptical. He thought that Song would not be able to cure his brother. But Mother couldn't trust just anyone, and Son's healer was considered the best. The warlord thought that there was no healer in all of Kaoxiang who could help his brother. But he remembered young Huabu and his words when he was going to rescue the wounded. Then Cao Ren said that there was a man who could cure tetanus. The woman immediately rushed to him asking where to find this healer. She was determined and immediately gave orders to immediately prepare everything to welcome such a person with all honors. As soon as the door slammed behind her, the commander only mentally wished her to be wise. In the poor man's village, Huabu practiced experiments in herbs. A military officer drove up to the house. He looked like he was in a hurry. The officer said that the warlord's older brother was in critical condition and asked Hwaba to hurry. The young man immediately rushed to pack his things and prepared to follow to the sick man. Hwaba grabbed the penicillin that he got experientially and jumped on his horse, commanding the officer to ride immediately. Without a second's hesitation, they galloped to the warlord's house. Squinting against the wind, Hwabu calculated that 10 days had passed since Cao Ren had told him about the ankle. He hoped it wasn't too late. From the door came the shouts of the servants who were scurrying about trying to help the young master. Cao Ren invited them to quickly follow him. But Hwabu immediately turned his attention to the warlord's leg. He guessed something but left the questions for later, following Cao Zheng. While Hwabu was talking himself into not jumping to conclusions, they had already come to the big one's room. Mother looked around excitedly, looking for the healer and wondering why he wasn't coming in. The colonel introduced Hwaba, saying he was the healer. The woman was angry and resentful that Cao Ren had entrusted his brother's health to some child. The warlord immediately began to defend Hwaba and told how he had saved a hopeless soldier. Since the young man's journey was long, Mother decided not to say nasty things. But she couldn't trust her eldest son to a healer not yet 20 years old. Hwabu had expected such a reaction and Cao Ren was confusedly silent. As the woman went to the patient's bedside, she said that it was better for them to observe the patient's condition for a while longer. Healer Sung was the best after all. After hearing this, Hwabu said goodbye and got ready to leave the room. But just at that moment, the patient had another agonizing attack. Hwabu clenched his hands, turned around, and followed towards the exit. It was already too late. The military officer brought the young man back to the poor man's village and apologized for the disturbance. He shared that the lady had always been kind and wise, but because of her eldest son's illness, she had become too sensitive. Hwabu thought this reaction from a woman was natural, but he said aloud that the elder young master wouldn't last more than a couple of days. At the entreaties of the military officer, Hwabu tried to explain that neither he nor anyone else would help him. But the healer also wondered if the warlord had stumbled on an iron spike. Hwabu noticed he was limping. The officer confirmed his hunch, but as far as he knew, the wound was not serious. Hwabu asked me to tell Cao Zhenyu and the healer that the warlord might have tetanus. A few days passed. Hwabu was seeing the sick in the village of the poor. He was just about to put a needle in the patient when there was a wild screech. Stepping out into the thief, Hwabu found the healer Bon treating the pig. He was just stitching up the animal's wound, which is why the pig was squealing so loudly. Carefully approaching Bon, Hwab noticed that he was practicing. The senior healer replied that it takes a lot of hard work to master the science. The young man asked if he was doing well. It turned out that Bon was unhappy that Hwabu was not teaching him and that his skills as a healer were not improving. The young man offered to set an example for him. The senior healer added that if the animal didn't survive, the people could at least eat. But Hwabu had already picked up the tools and began to show how to stitch the vessel together. When it was done, Healer Bon remarked that it was too fast. But according to Hwabu, accuracy was more important, and speed would come with experience. The healer continued practicing while the young man watched and gave advice. At last, Bon managed to join the vessel independently and smoothly. Meanwhile, in his house, the warlord was shouting angrily at the healer who could have saved his brother. He justified himself by saying that he had done his best. They argued behind the inconsolable woman's back. It was too terrible a disease. Healer Song said that no one could save young master, not even a celestial. After saying that, the mother ordered them to leave. In desperation, Cao Ren struck the column. He had to stand his ground to the last man. In the village of the poor, they decided to cook pork and the villagers gathered at the house where Hwabu conducted experiments and received patients. People were enjoying the food and the young man along with them. Healer Bon watched Hwabu greedily devour the meat. Finally, he couldn't stand it and asked the young man if he was a high-ranking official. But their meal and conversation were interrupted by unexpected guests. One of them was supporting the other, who had stepped on a thorn while picking grass. After examining Hwabu's leg, he concluded that it looked like tetanus. The patient was horrified at this diagnosis. He did not want to die. Physician Bon started talking about amputating the ankle, but Hwabu said that would not happen because it was in the early stages and the leg could be cured. The senior healer couldn't believe his ears and stared at the young man in amazement. Hwabu was already rolling up his sleeves and reiterated that it was possible to cure this. 4 more days passed, and Hwabu was satisfied that the patient was on the mend. Now Healer Bon couldn't understand how the young man had made the swelling disappear in 4 days. He concentrated on watching Hwabu's actions carefully, but the young man pushed the healer out of the room. Bon knocked on the locked door and asked to be let in. He wanted to know the secret of the cure. The healer was willing to offer any money and become Hwabu's apprentice. A military officer drove up to the house. He recognized Bon and started shouting that there was trouble. An agitated officer told me that the commander had fallen. and the lady immediately wished to see the healer Bon at her place. Huabu overheard this conversation. His suspicions were justified. Cao Zheng had tetanus. At the warlord's house, the healer Bon, together with his mother, were already at the bedside of the sick man. The healer examined Cao Zhen's swollen leg, already suspecting that the patient had tetanus. The warlord's mother wanted to know what this terrible disease was, and Cao Ren was ahead of the physician with the answer, confirming that he had tetanus. Out of terror, the woman began to faint and fell. The healer and the colonel didn't catch her in time and she ended up on the floor. The men started calling loudly for help, hoping they would be heard. When she was able to be placed on the bed, the physician Bon checked the woman's pulse. The fainting was caused by fright. The colonel was relieved and made a request to the healer. Cao Ren said that his older brother couldn't withstand the disease and died after his ankle was amputated, but he couldn't follow the same path. And if it wasn't too late, he wanted to ask Huaba to amputate the infected limb. The child's life was not to end before the parents, and this was his last request as a warlord. The healer Bon apologized but admitted he couldn't fulfill it. And he told me that a young healer is now treating tetanus without amputating limbs. The mistress came to her senses and heard those words. She couldn't believe it was true. The poor man's village had visitors again. It was the military officer again. Huaba had been summoned again. The young man asked if the warlord was conscious and, having received an affirmative answer, began to pack. Grabbing a bag with everything he needed, he was ready to go. In the warlord's house, the mistress blamed herself for everything, and she was sorry for being careless with the young healer last time. Cao Ren reassured mother and promised that everything would be fine. He told me that for this healer, the sick always came first. Cao Zhenya's father, Colonel Chang Shui, entered the room. He immediately began to resent his son for not lying down. Chang Shui didn't let his son say hello and told him to get ready. He had found a healer in Luoyang and they should have set off immediately. Cao Zhenya's mother rushed over to her husband. The healer was due to arrive soon and she asked him to wait a little longer. Chang Shui was unwilling to listen to her after the death of her eldest son because she had spoken then as well. He had already heard rumors that she had sent for the young healer. Chang Shui threatened to strangle him if the boy interfered. Huabu had already arrived and was heading determinedly towards the sick man. Having said all, Chang Shui announced the start of the training camp and got ready to leave the room. The woman pushed him with both hands to his back in desperation. He didn't keep his balance and fell into the supply room. Dazedly lying on the floor, he tried to stop her, but the mistress had snapped a lock on the door that was supposed to keep her spouse out. Cao Ren could only stand back and observe what was happening. The woman was shaking with sobs and threats and blows were heard from behind the door. At that moment, Huabu walked into the room looking around in surprise. Weeping, the lady on her knees rushed to him to beg him to save her son. Huabu took her palms in his hands and told her not to worry. The angry, screaming Chang Shui was released from his confinement. The woman admitted she found a healer who can cure tetanus. Chang Shui shouted that this was nonsense and he found a healer in Luoyang. Then the lady replied that her stupidity had caused the death of her eldest son and she would not let it happen again. In the poor man's village, Huaba was examined by Cao Zhenya. The young man didn't understand why things weren't progressing as usual and the rigor mortis in his leg wasn't progressing. He warned the warlord that he had to feel the sore leg. Cao Ren felt pain from the young healer's touch. Huabu was surprised at how calmly the warlord spoke of pain. He would not have been able to say a word himself in such a situation. Cao Ren explained that it was because he was using internal qi. When Huabu heard about controlling internal energy, he was distracted and squeezed his leg harder, causing a severe attack of pain. The young man thought that since both Cao Ren and his brother knew how to handle internal energy, perhaps they were the generals of the three kingdoms. The warlord asked if Huabu could cure him, and the latter promised to return everything to the way it was. To begin with, he handed Cao Zhenyu a bottle of strong drink. It was supposed to help reduce the pain. The warlord grinned. It was too small a dose for him to pass out. He opened the bottle and took a sip. But before he could finish the phrase that he had the ability to tolerate any doses of strong drinks, Cao Ren fell asleep. Huabu agreed that it was certainly a nice feature and put the mask on. He secured the infected leg so that it was suspended. The colonel had already regained consciousness. It was sooner than Huabu had anticipated. Cao asked if everything had already been done, but only the main part of the work had been done. Huabu thought about it. The situation was more serious than he had realized, and an epileptic seizure could happen at any time. To be effective, antibiotics should be administered in large doses and preferably by injection. The issue of injection devices had to be resolved. Huabu asked the colonel if he knew of a good blacksmith. Cao replied that in Qiaoxiang, the best was Pyongjun from the smelter. The young man remembered this blacksmith. He had approached him before. Huabu quickly drew something on paper and said that he needed this blacksmith to produce something similar within today. Cao Ren scrutinized the paper and loudly called out to military officer Huang, who was waiting outside. The officer immediately proceeded inside the room, and the warlord instructed to tell Pyongjun to place an order today. Wang rushed to carry out the task. Cao Ren was sure that this blacksmith would definitely be able to make the necessary tools. In the forge, Byung-jun studied the paper. The order was stacked. The officer said that the item would be used to treat the warlord. The blacksmith excitedly asked about Chao Jung's injury. This upset Byung-jun because the colonel had contracted the same disease as his brother. But the military officer was sure he'd be all right. Because the patient was being treated by the skillful healer Hua, that's what Huaba was respectfully called. The young healer noticed that the patient's condition was rapidly deteriorating, and if Cao stopped using his internal qi, he would start internal rigor mortis. Assistant Bo came running in. He brought the healer's bong and seok pill with him. They all put on their masks and were ready to begin their treatment. Huab needed to make an incision in the inflamed leg. The senior healers had to keep a close eye on the patient. Huab was to remove the pus and dead flesh. The rate of infection increased and an abscess developed. Tissue necrosis was highly progressive. Since he still had no injection instruments, the medicine had to be injected directly into the vein through an incision. Huabu was going to inject penicillin through a pig's blood vessel. It had to be done carefully and slowly. The senior healers watched the process closely. Suddenly, the warlord's condition worsened, and he began to have convulsions. It couldn't have been the shock of the drug being administered. So Cao Ren had experienced very strong muscle spasms before. Seok Pil tried to hold the warlord back while healer Bon urgently searched for acupuncture tools. With his technique, Bon was able to take away muscle cramps. Wab needed to finish the surgery while the senior healers held the patient. After a while, Cao Ren came to his senses. He heard Huabu talking to another patient. The healer told the joyful patient that he could come to him no more, and in 5 days he would walk as before. The man bowed and thanked Huaba. He thought the tetanus would kill him. He held out a small pouch of money in gratitude, but the young healer refused. The former patient had already promised to bring him herbs, and with that money he could feed his family. Deputy Obo rushed to escort the man home. Huabu noticed that the warlord had regained consciousness. That was good news. He immediately informed the stunned Cao Ren that the leg did not have to be amputated, and rather added that the promise had been kept. The joyful commander thanked his young healer and asked when he would finally recover. Huabu recalled that he had asked Cao Zhen to come before it got that bad and the leg was intact. The treatment should take much longer. A joyous, cured patient ran into the room with a full basket of herbs. For a healer, he was careful to choose the best plants. The man started to say goodbye in a hurry, but Huabu noticed that the basket was too heavy for the herbs. And as the young man began to shake the plants out of the basket, a pouch fell out. Huabu shouted to his assistant to grab this man before he escaped. Seeing that the child was running out of time, the healer threw the money at the man. Resenting that he was trying to pay him again, Huabu wrinkled his nose in pain. He must have swung too hard. Cao Ren wondered why the healer didn't charge for the treatment. After all, he could have gotten more and he definitely needed something to eat. Then Huabu pointed to the plants the patient had brought and said he had already gotten even more. This dialogue was overheard by Colonel Chang Shui. He considered treatment without money to be foolishness. Meanwhile, Cao Ren clarified whether he would need to pay for the treatment. This question made the young healer laugh very hard, and an angry Chang Shui clenched his fists and returned to his horse. His wife was in the palanquin. She was surprised to see her husband and asked why he was here. Warlord Chang Shui didn't answer her anything and silently jumped onto his horse. When she repeated her question, he tossed over his shoulder that he wanted to see his son's condition. A few days later, Huabu examined the leg and was pleased. Most likely soon, Warlord Cao Ren would be able to go home. But the man asked if his older brother would have survived if Huabu had treated him. The young man replied that he did not know. The healer's job was to heal and the patient's job was to get well. Therefore, Cao Zhenyu should have focused on his health, especially since Huabu had promised it to his mother. The young healer cheerfully added that the warlord was destined to live to a ripe old age. Cao Ren was embarrassed. He did not know how to look into the eyes of the healer. Then Huabu took a stool and placed it next to the bed of the sick man. Sitting down on it, he planted his foot on his leg and crossed his arms. The healer then slyly inquired what the warlord was going to pay, and as payment for the treatment, he asked to be taught how to manage internal energy. Cao Ren began to refuse. This art had to be kept a secret that Huabu could not know about, nor could other outsiders. Huabu waited, and then the warlord inquired as to why he needed the inner qi. Then the young man said that he had almost died once when he was attacked with a sword, and after that he decided that he could not end his life in vain. He couldn't die. At least one more person had to be saved. Cao Ren thought that this healer could save many more people and he might need help himself. The colonel listened to Huabu's reason for wanting to train, but this knowledge was a family secret, and he couldn't decide everything on his own. Cao Zhenyu had to convince his father to give him permission to train. Back home, the warlord drank tea with Chang Shui. He was about to tell his father something important. Cao Ren was going to get on a horse soon, but his father asked him to focus on recovering. He added that judging by the success of the treatment, the young doctor was a very talented young man. He asked for a price for the treatment. The son replied that apparently Huab didn't need the money. The healer asked to be trained in the breathing streams of the celestial. Chang Shui thought that his son had already made up his mind, for if the request had been absurd, he would not have told him about it. And since he did ask his father's opinion, he agreed. It was not a great price to pay for saving his child's life. At the makeshift Huabu hospital the next day, the man who obtained the plants for him returned again. He said that looking for plants became more difficult because there were many thorns scattered on the mountain. The healer looked at the plants. He was missing the root of the round wheatgrass. It would be a good painkiller for his mother. When asked if he knew where to get the root, the man answered in the affirmative, but the whole place was covered with thorns. Huaba was not deterred by this and said they would go together. And despite the man's surprise, Huabu began to pack. He really needed that plant. At the same time, they could collect the dangerous thorns that were scattered there. When they were already going up the mountain, the man asked the healer to be careful not to stumble. Huabu saw that there were spikes lying in solid rows on the ground. It was a so-called border to keep the soldiers out, and if he stepped on one of those spikes, he'd definitely get tetanus. Suddenly, the man gave a frightened shriek and jumped back from where he was looking for roots. He pointed to something that frightened him. There was a man lying up ahead. Huabu went over to take a look. The man lying there was not alive, probably mauled by wild animal. Next to this man, he noticed a sword. Soldiers didn't use them, so it was an outlaw. Mujina discovered another man nearby. The second one passed away relatively recently. He was an outlaw too. Huabu noticed that the man had an object tied to his arm. The young man untied the box from his hand and ventured to open it. Inside, he found a parchment with important information. When his companion inquired about it, Huabu hid his find and replied that it was simply a list of inns and eateries. And he added that it must have been a list of places the robbers were going to rob next time. The man was satisfied with that answer. For today, he decided to finish packing and head down. The bags were filled with spikes. Huabu returned to his hospital. Cao Ren was already waiting there. He was surprised to see so many thorns, but the healer explained that he had decided to collect them so no one would accidentally step on them. That would be dangerous. Huabu examined the patient's leg and went on to say that iron was money too. The warlord agreed. As he continued his examination, the healer thought about the fact that there was no record of Cao Zheng colluding with the brigands, but there was no one else but him. Huabu held out the parchment he had found to the warlord. It contained information on when and how many people were to arrive in the village. After reading what was written, Cao Ren became very angry. Huabu took a brush and started writing something. He said he was doing it for safety. He wrote that it was from the Black Mountain Bandit. These bandits were more dangerous than usual. They were led by Zhang Yan. The warlord read what was written and gritted his teeth. This information was a military secret. It was about the troops that were going on the march. Some traitor was passing military secrets to the brigands. Cao Ren thanked Huaba. He had not only saved his life, but also found valuable information. The warlord promised that he would owe the healer for this, and added that father had authorized Huaba to be trained in spiritual energy. Cao Ren was ready to start training right now and catch the brigands at the same time. But Huabu warned him that if the wound festered, he would have to amputate the limb at the knee. This argument convinced the warlord to start training next time. Huabu said that from Cao Zheng's appearance, anyone could guess his condition. In order to deceive the enemy, one had to deceive an ally first. The warlord wondered who this healer was since on top of everything else, he was also discussing strategy. The next day, Huabu had lunch with his brothers at home. Huabok stiffened when the younger brother announced that he had had enough and was about to leave them. He indifferently asked Huabu if he was going to play healer again, but he had other plans. The younger brother wanted to visit the Song family and find out about the abandoned mines. Huabok thought Huabu wanted to mine for gold, but he was just going to store the ingredients for the potions there. The abandoned mine needed money to rent, and Huabok wondered if his younger brother had any. He could give some if he needed it, but the younger brother assured me that everything was fine and he didn't need the money. He made quite a lot of money, which he told his older brother about. Huabu left the room and the brothers only looked at him. They wondered if he had cured so many patients and how much he was being paid to treat them. Huabun suggested that the rumors that have been circulating are true. Huabok didn't even know what rumors we were talking about. And they were that their younger brother cured a warlord of tetanus. This news stunned the older brother. This disease was not easy to cure. Huabun didn't pay much attention to the rumors at first, but he found out that the warlord had gone to a poor man's village. He also said that their brother had saved many soldiers and cured a disease that even the famous healer's son couldn't handle. There were also rumors that the healer Bon was studying under Huabu. Huabok couldn't believe his ears. This was one of the 3 most famous healers in the city. And if the rumors were true, Huabu's skills were better than the healers of Sona and Bona combined. Huabok remarked that their brother had always been special, and if he had the desire to learn, he would have revived their family. But Huabun was glad that Huabu had chosen medicine. All the important positions were occupied by members of the Chao family, and it would be difficult for their brother to break through. Huabok announced that he had had enough and hurried away. Before he left, he said that there was no telling what would happen next year. Huabun stared after him and thought that in time his brother would accept Huabu's choice. Wondering why Junior had gone to Sun's family, he remembered the incident at the inn and the friends who had fought. The guy who almost took his friend's life introduced himself as Sung Jong Pan, which means he was from the Song family. At this time, Song Chong Pan was sitting in his office studying documents when a servant came running in and announced Huabu's arrival. The young master was surprised because he had never dealt with anyone from the Hua family before. But then he remembered that incident and the young healer. As he headed towards him, he wondered what the healer wanted from him. Sung Jong Pang wanted to put everything related to his former friend out of his mind as soon as possible. But upon reaching the door, he smiled happily and greeted Huaba, still wondering if he needed the money. After all, the healer knew he was from the merchant militia. Over a cup of tea, Huabu admitted that he would like to lease the mine for about 2 years. Song Yongpan was not opposed but warned the healer not to claim the gold if he found it there. Huabu explained that a closed mine is good for storing medicines since they are temperature sensitive. To himself, Song Jongpan wondered how much he would pay. But he smiled and offered the guest a treat and postponed the conversation until after the meal. Huabu took one cookie and tasted it. It tasted sweet. Perhaps honey had been used for that. Song Chongpan watched as the young healer was impressed by the ordinary sweets. Eating the cookies, Huabu remembered the young man's promise to repay him for saving his friend. He wondered if he would give him a discount. Song Jongpan announced the price. It was 100 nannies per month. Huabu dropped the remains of the treat and clarified that it was definitely a monthly price and not a yearly price. Upset, he bowed and said he would think about it. As he left, Huabu thought that for that price he could hire men and dig the cave himself. Song Chongpan watched as the healer left. He was happy that he didn't have to deal with the poor official's family. Huabu returned to the poor man's village. Cao Ren was waiting for him on the bed. The warlord realized from the young healer's face that the deal with the closed mine had failed. But he hurriedly handed over the box that was given to him by the blacksmith Byung-jun. There were new tools in the drawer. They were even better than Huabu had imagined. While looking at them, the young man thought that he needed to teach Obo how to use them, and then the kid could assist him. Huabu went home to his sick mother as soon as possible. First thing he did was ask how she was feeling. Turns out she's much better. She hasn't fully recovered, but my youngest son's recipe helped a lot. Huabu asked for permission to inspect and rolled up his sleeves. By probing his abdomen, he was clarifying where the pain was worse. One place proved to be too painful. Huabu was puzzled. It could have been a mass in the small intestine. When the bile didn't come out, it caused hardening in the small intestine. But cholecystitis didn't cause it so quickly. There had to be another cause, and it could have been the liver. Huabu pressed again and caused another bout of pain. He asked Mother to roll over on her stomach to continue the examination. Feeling Huabu's back, he noticed it was swollen. It was a sign of liver steatosis. In this disease, fat cells were replacing liver cells. He asked if Mother was feeling tired. The woman admitted to feeling tired even when she barely woke up. Something was hurting all the time. Huabu started examining his mother's legs. It was hurting her too. He decided to utilize the acupuncture knowledge he had gained. That should have given him the extra time win. Seizures may have started between 3 and 6 months. Huab needed to find out why steatosis developed so suddenly and quickly. Then he could stop the disease. A maid came into the room. It was time to take the medicine. Huabu asked her to go outside to talk to him for a few minutes. When they left the room, the young man asked if his mother consumed alcohol. The woman started to deny it, but Huabu realized that was the case. It wasn't encouraged at the time, but if there was strong drink, there had to be food. He asked the maid about it. Turns out the appetizer was regular lard. The information horrified Huaba. It was the worst combination of foods. Strong drinks and fatty foods led to fatty liver degeneration. Back in the room, he warned his mother that for now she was not allowed to eat meat or alcohol. The woman frightenedly began to justify that she had never tasted strong drinks. Huabu nonchalantly continued that the ban was even more about lard than meat, but tried to reassure my mother that this ban was due to illness and it was temporary. But lard as an appetizer should have been abandoned for good. The young man promised to earn a lot of money and buy his mother beef. Leaving the room, Huabu thought about how there was no time at all. In order to do the surgery, he needed to train Bo as soon as possible. Taking a bag of collected spikes, Huabu came to the house of the warlord Cao Zhenyu. Mrs. Cao was happy to see healer Hua. A woman noticed a bag with spikes and asked what it was. When she learned that one such served as the cause of Cao Zhenyu's illness, Madame asked what was the reason Huabu had brought it to her house. The young man said that he would like the Cao family to buy back the spikes. Seeing the woman's puzzled look, he explained that they couldn't just leave them on the mountain. People could get hurt. Upon reflection, Mrs. Cao said she could sell them to the smelter. Huabu said he would like to sell them for a higher price, much to the woman's delight. After all, he still refused to take money in gratitude. The woman clarified whether it was true that he treated the poor and did not charge them money. The young healer noticed that for basic treatment and disease detection, it didn't make sense. But increasingly, money was needed to make various concoctions. That's why he came to her with such a strange request. He admitted that wealthy patients don't come to the poor people's village, but if he leaves the village, the poor people will not be able to be treated. Mrs. Cao recognized that Huabu was not only a capable healer, but also felt a moral obligation. And the Cao family bought the thorns. But the price was set by the buyer, and she asked the young man not to complain. As payment, she held out a box containing 100 liang of silver. It was 10,000 nyans in coin. Huabu tried to object that it was too high a price for spikes, but the lady replied that it was her right to set the price. At this time, Warlord Cao Ren looked into the room. He was surprised to see the healer. He grabbed Huaba's hand and pulled him to practice. It turned out Cao had been looking for him all over the village. The warlord resented having to search for his apprentice, and Huabu excused himself that he had not a couple of patients, but many more. In the courtyard, Cao Ren asked the young man to warn his family that he would not return home tonight, and the training began. First, Huab had to learn the secret technique of breathing streams of the celestial. The warlord began to tell a long backstory of the technique, and Huabu grew weary of listening. Cao Ren warned that no one should know about this technique, not even family members. He will only begin training after swearing the Huabu oath, and if a young man breaks his vow, the gods will punish him and the whole family will be stained. And anyone with the last name Cao will be his enemy. Finally, the opening speeches were over, and the colonel was about to begin his training. The most important thing in this technique was breathing. You had to spread your legs shoulder-width apart and take a belly breath, uniting heaven and earth. Huabu began to repeat the movements after his teacher. Watching the young man, the commander thought he was doing a pretty good job. After an hour, Huabu was exhausted. Even just breathing was hard, and he could feel his stomach churning. Cao Ren reached out his hand to check his disciple's stomach. If he did everything correctly, heat should appear. The warlord sensed Huaba's inner qi. He was surprised that the young man was able to gather energy just by starting his training. An exhausted Huabu asked if he was okay. Cao was slow to answer. He didn't understand what his disciple was all about. Then Huabu thanked for the lesson and promised to practice even at home. And Cao Ren thought that he couldn't have nascent inner qi, and he was most likely mistaken, but recognized that there was a natural talent in this young man. It took the warlord himself 3 days to repeat the pose and 10 days to learn to breathe. But Huabu did it all at once. And he did it in half an hour. Cao didn't understand how it was possible. The blacksmith, Byung-jun, was visited by his older brother. The guest held out a sword granted by the county superintendent. He needed to be corrected. Looking at the weapons, the blacksmith was glad his brother had finally been promoted. He confirmed that he had been promoted and the field work was over. And despite looking good, my brother couldn't even lift a spear. He showed Byung-jun the scar that dissected the entire abdomen. The blacksmith looked at the healed wound and marveled at how one could survive after such a thing. Turns out, if it wasn't for Mr. Hua, brother wouldn't be alive. Byung-jun guessed that he was talking about the healer who had cured Cao Zheng's warlord from tetanus. Suddenly, 2 more visitors peeked into the forge. It was Huabu and the military officer. Huang asked if the head of the blacksmiths was here. Everyone greeted each other. The officer was acquainted with the former tensman and now the head of the border detachment. Huang introduced Byung-jun to the young healer. Huab was pleased to meet him. The blacksmith looked at him and wondered how such a child could be a skilled healer. The head of the border guard unit Wu began to bow and thank the young man. Although the young man could not remember who this man was, Huabu began to remember if he had been to Mask Mountain, and Wu confirmed that he had been rescued, even though his stomach was cut open. The young man remembered this patient and was very happy that he had recovered. He immediately rushed to examine the healed wound. Huabu said the man's stomach had been cut open. He didn't remember that. The healer asked if the man still had black stool. While the healer and the former patient were discussing the intricacies of peristalsis, Byung-jun was amazed to think that Huabu had saved a man with a ruptured intestine. The young man explained that once the stool was normal in color, the wounds were finally healed. The man was also not allowed to drink alcohol. Toth asked embarrassedly if the rule could be waived for a day. He was going to celebrate his promotion. Huaba allowed it, but warned that in a year's time the man would be on the other side of the world. The blacksmith's brother was impressed by such an argument. The healer gave some more recommendations about nutrition. At the end, he held out a small black ball in the palm of his hand. The man looking at the pill asked what kind of medicine it was. Huabu replied that it would help if the intestinal condition worsened and could cure tetanus. The interlocutor was frightened that he had tetanus, but the healer reassured him that there was nothing wrong with it. Byung-jun asked, "Isn't it a precious medicine then?" But for Huabu, human life was more important. At that moment, the blacksmith master introduced himself and said that he was the head of the blacksmiths. Huabu admitted he owed him a debt of gratitude. The tools he had made had saved many people. Byung-jun was embarrassed and thanked for the kind words. But the blacksmith was very curious if Mr. Hua could really cure tetanus. Officer Huang confirmed it. That question made Huabu think the blacksmith was infected with tetanus. Turns out he didn't get tetanus. Some of the workers at the forge did. And if the drug was on the market, he'd want to buy it. The young man thought that if the blacksmith was still infected, he should be examined to see how far the disease had spread. But Byung-jun hesitated, not because he was sick, but because he was shy to ask about the price of the medicine. He finally asked the question. Before answering, Huabu asked the military officer to call for Obo. The young man started to bring things out of his bag. Since he had come all this way, he had to strike while the iron was hot. Byung-jun brought the blacksmiths who were sick. There were 5 of them. 3 were definitely sure of the illness of the head blacksmith. 2 were in doubt. But it turned out they weren't all sick. 4 more were having trouble moving. So Huabu asked him to take him to them. First, we had to look at the people who were in bad shape. They came to the room where the sick were lying. Byung-jun told everyone to get up. But it was enough for the young healer that they just woke up and didn't leave their beds. Smith explained that these people are slaves to other government departments, so they are not in the best condition. Byung-jun was worried that he wouldn't have enough money for treatment, but Huabu asked him to make more medical instruments instead. The blacksmith didn't believe Mr. Hua was being serious at first. The young man explained that since the blacksmith was taking responsibility for these patients, the healer would rather take something else as payment instead of money. And he needed the golden hands of the head blacksmith more than money. After all, they made tools that saved people's lives. Byung-jun understood everything and decided to start the task immediately. But then Huabu exclaimed that one of the patients didn't have tetanus. The man was lying on his side, clutching his stomach. With tetanus, he'd be arching backwards. Huabu began to probe his stomach, watching for a painful reaction. Byung-jun cautiously asked what kind of disease it was. Mr. Hua identified this ailment as appendicitis. The resulting X-ray vision again helped in making the diagnosis. Huabu told the patient that if the abdomen hurts on the right side, there's a chance the man won't survive. The sick man begged the healer to save him. If he was gone, his elderly mother and young daughter would also die. Huabu explained that there was one way to cure him, but it would require cutting open his stomach and removing a small piece of intestine. Byung-jun told the frightened man that healer Hua had already saved his brother Park by cutting off part of his intestines. The blacksmith thought it was enough to treat the patient. Huabu at this point thought the operation to remove the appendix was pretty simple, but he was missing some tools. He asked the blacksmith how fast he could make the tools. Byung-jun needed about 4 days. Huabu pondered tensely. 4 days was a long time, and whether he would be able to carry out the operation with what he had now. But it turned out that the blacksmith had another set of fabricated tools. When ordering the healer, Bon asked him to make one for him as well. Byung-jun held out the healer's tools to Bong Huab. He was going to go make new tools and asked the healer to take care of the sick man. The man's wife had recently passed away, but the young healer interrupted, saying he would do his best for the patient regardless of life circumstances. Huabu scheduled the surgery for the next day and informed the patient of this. He also warned the man that from that moment on he was not allowed to eat or drink anything. And lastly, the healer Hua promised to be sure to cure him. Late at night, a wealthy visitor came to Kisan's house. It was Healer Song who was greeted with all the honors. The people around him considered him the best healer in Xiaoxiang, and he agreed. No matter how famous other healers were, it was the healer Sona that the rich sought out. He was invited to proceed to a secluded gazebo. The hostess was happy to see the famous guest. He hadn't visited for a long time. After sitting down, Healer Song asked to invite a girl named Myung Sung. The woman did not know what to do because the girl was busy with another visitor. This news brought Sona out of a benevolent mood. Mrs. Ho suggested inviting another girl, Wol Sung, but the guest thought there was nothing special about her. But the idea of bringing Hua Sung made him happy. He sympathized with that girl. The mistress immediately instructed Su's maid to call Hua, and after that she asked for drinks and food to be brought to Plum Blossom's room. In Physician Song's opinion, the maid was very pretty. He asked when it was time to put her hair up. It was after the first time alone with the visitor, the girl slicked her hair up. But Mrs. Ho said she was just a child. That didn't bother the guest at all. Hei Su was walking down the hallway with a serving tray. Along the way, she ran into a very young girl. The child handed the girl a rice ball to eat. She had worked all night and must be hungry. Hei Su thanked the child for the opportunity to have a snack. They were sisters. It was to be their grandmother's anniversary in a few days. For this date, the little girl had already obtained permission from Mrs. Ho, and they had planned to give them a chaperone for security. Scary Sister thought it was not for security but for surveillance. But the girls had work to do and said goodbye. The next day, Huabu and his assistant Bo went in for surgery to remove his appendix. The young man noticed that Bo was tense and thinking about something. Clapping the boy on the back, he asked him to relax. Bo was worried he couldn't do it, but Huabu said he was doing the best he could and the assistant should follow his words. And do whatever it takes to help the healer, and it's okay to worry when something happens. Everything was prepared for the operation. Huabu said it was quite simple and not to be nervous. They even had an ambu made out of a pig's bladder. It was the name of a ventilator bag. They put on their masks. Huabu took the scalpel. It was time to begin the operation. The young man was making the incision, and the assistant was holding a red-hot instrument to cauterize the wound. It had to be done quickly. The young healer watched Bo's actions. It was the abdominal wall and care should have been taken. Huab had a hard time identifying the appendix by feel. He lacked an X-ray. At that moment, his X-ray vision came back on. The inflamed area was immediately visible. He didn't know if it was due to concentration or desperation, but he was glad. Bo suddenly shouted that the patient had stopped breathing. Huabu grabbed the ambu and started ventilating his lungs. He couldn't let the man go to the other side of the world during appendicitis surgery. When his breathing was almost restored, the young man continued. The boy watched the healer admiringly. Huabu was sewing up the incision. He asked his assistant to prepare scissors and a needle. Bo looked perplexed at the healer and asked again what he should do. When breathing recovered fully, Huabu had to continue the operation. This required instruments. Peeking out from behind the young healer's arm, the assistant saw the patient begin to breathe. Bo thought in shock that this was nothing compared to tetanus treatment. The boy didn't know if the patient would live, but if he would live, the child was now witnessing with his own eyes the divine art of healing. After finishing the operation and waiting for the patient to regain consciousness, Huabu advised him to lie down and not to drink anything until the gas was out. The man thanked the young healer for saving him. Bo couldn't believe that the patient actually survived. He thought he was bound to learn it and become like the young master. The boy wanted to save the dying, but only the assistant decided to say his wish out loud as Huabu interrupted him. The young man praised him for his good work and encouraged him to also try harder next time. Assistant Bo cheerfully agreed he was ready for it. As the young man was catching his breath after the operation, the blacksmith entered the room. While the healer and assistant were chatting merrily, Byung-jun stared at the operated patient in shock. The man actually survived after his stomach was cut open. It shocked the blacksmith. After thanking Hwaba for his work, Byung-jun noticed that he had no weapons. The young man lived in a dangerous world. The young man explained that he keeps meaning to buy a sword but keeps forgetting to do so, and he had just started to learn martial arts. Byung-jun turned around and headed towards the wall of the forge. Taking the sword off the wall, he said he was always worried that the man who saved the blacksmith wasn't weak. Byung-jun held out the blade he had forged to Hwab and asked him to accept it as a gift. The young man started to refuse. He had been offered various things and money in gratitude before, but this was the first time he had been offered a gun. The blacksmith assured me that the sword was perfect for him. It was light and strong. Fastening the blade on Hwabu's belt, the blacksmith said he would be glad if this weapon could help the young healer. After these words, the young man gratefully accepted the sword. The following evening, Healer Song spent time at Ki-sing's house again. The girl sitting next to him asked if he knew about the rumors about Warlord Cao. Sleep recalled that the warlord only grabbed him by the collar because he couldn't cure his tetanus. When he learned that Cao Ren was also infected with the disease, the healer laughed. Now the warlord would beg him again for treatment. But the girl replied that she wasn't sure if Cao would resort to a healer again. Healer Song believed that no one but him and Kyeoxiang could save him. When the healer heard that the colonel had been cured, he was outraged. He believed that tetanus could not be cured without amputation. The girl said that the youngest son of the Hua family had cured him. Sung couldn't remember such a healer, and began to explain to his companion that nowadays, anyone can call himself a healer. The boy probably started the rumors himself. The girl reflected on the fact that if these rumors reached Warlord Chang Shui, he wouldn't just leave it at that. The healer's mood visibly soured and he hurriedly left Ki-seng's house. On the way, he wondered why this Mr. Hua-san was bothering him so much. At this time, Huabu was practicing in his backyard. Suddenly, he felt something in his hand. The young man gathered all his energy into a fist and was about to strike the training pole. The impact caused the pole to break in half. Looking at the result of his training, Huabu couldn't believe he had done it himself. The next day, he was showing Colonel Cao how his independent studies had progressed. Cao Ren watched in shock. In his opinion, Huabu was a genius. But with an indifferent look, he asked if the student could feel the heat in the golden core. It was the place where internal energy accumulated. Hearing a positive answer, the warlord asked if Huabu planned to take the martial arts pavilion exam. It wasn't medicine-related, so the young man had no such plans. But Chow thought he was missing his chance. Those who could learn to work with internal qi in a couple of months were considered geniuses. It usually took several years. Huabu realized that the warlord shouldn't have seen him move using internal energy. He asked Chao Zhenya embarrassedly whether in a year he would be able to break the board with his bare hands, which made him laugh a lot. A year was a very small amount of time. The warlord headed for the huge stone in the courtyard. He was about to strike a rock and took a special pose. Using his internal energy, the warlord struck and the stone shattered into pieces. It took at least 3 years to gain such power. Thanks to the Chao family's secret technique, the training will only take 3 years, but it usually takes at least 10 years. Cao Ren advised his disciple to train hard. The commander said he'd expect the young man here tomorrow night. He had business with Huab, but he didn't reveal what it was. The next day, the young healer rushed to the Cao family's house as they had agreed. When he was almost there, he was called out by the blacksmith, Byung-jun. They greeted each other and inquired about their health. Byung-jun was also walking towards the Chao family, but seemed to be not very happy about it. Coal was delivered for the troops and he was asked to test it. So his visit was purely for verification. Among the people supplying coal, Huabu spotted Song Zhongpan. He was just assuring the head blacksmith that his products are of the best quality. Song Zhongpan also noticed Huaba inspecting the baskets of coal. The merchant wondered what the young man was doing here and why the head blacksmith was so polite to him. Cao Ren, the warlord, walked over to them and put his hand on Huabu's shoulder in a friendly manner. Song Chongpan watched with his mouth hanging open as the young healer left with the warlord. Cao Ren wanted to introduce someone to the young man. Huabu and young Master Cao were heading towards a pair of men talking. One of them was Xiaohu Dun, the warlord's third cousin. He was in charge of the 1st Mounted Army. He had heard of Huabu and was excited to meet him. Song Zhongpan watched what was happening and didn't understand what was going on. Why is a young man from an impoverished family on such good terms with both the head blacksmith and the warlord? Song Zhongpan was approached by his father and asked what was going on. The young merchant said he knew Huabu, and I rushed to meet him to say hello. His father thought that since this young man was on such good terms with the commander and the governor, it would be a good idea to get him. Song Chongpan approached Byung-jun and asked if the head blacksmith had already looked around. Byung-jun would like to see more. Here was not enough coal presented, but the merchant again assured him of top quality. Song Chongpan pretended to have just noticed Huaba and greeted him cheerfully, and in front of the head blacksmith inquired how the young healer was doing. Byung-jun was interested in how he knew the Hua healer. Song Zhongpan said that it was his fault that Sang-duk was badly injured, but Huabu was there to save him. The blacksmith left, and the merchant asked if Mr. Hua had thought about leasing the mine. Huabu replied that the price was unreasonably high and he would refuse. Song Chongpan realized that the healer still needed the mine and this was his chance. He asked why the young man was giving up so easily. The merchant offered a rent-free lease in exchange for Huabu's help in supplying coal. Huabu was surprised that Song Zhongpan was so obviously trying to pull a deal and was so underhanded. The merchant said goodbye, promising to wait for good news, and the young man wondered if he needed to live up to those expectations. A little later, there was an unpleasant conversation going on in the house of the Song merchant family. Mr. Song was furious because a lot of money had been spent, but they had not received the coal order. All officials refused the offered bribes. The young master tried to calm his father down, but he made him even angrier. After all, he had said he had made a deal with the young healer Hua. Barely containing his fury, the elder lord asked what exactly his son had asked the young man for. The young merchant admitted that the request was for Huabu to put in a good word with the head of the smiths and get the mine leased for free. His father attacked him with more insults. He should have donated the mine, not offered to lease it. Mr. Song was so angry that he overturned the table and shouted his son's dismissal from the trade militia. The young man rushed to beg for forgiveness. He was going to go to Mr. Hua right away to apologize. At Kaisen's house, the girls packed for the road. The youngest girl collected gifts for the villagers. The man they were given to escort them clarified that their house was really in the village of the poor. Then they set out on their journey. Big Sister was curious how their neighbors and friends were doing. The panting little girl said she heard Obo was okay. The attendant followed them silently behind. As they approached the village, the girls saw that many people had gathered outside their house. At this time, Huabu was bandaging another patient's leg. Assistant Obo was also busy talking to the patients. Some of the men were lying on mats in the courtyard. The attendant assessed the situation and asked if the girls had sold their house. Su replied that they decided to rent it out, and justifying herself by adding that she didn't think there would be a hospital there. A hospital in such a place seemed to the attendant a rather strange decision. Entering the courtyard, they were surprised to find a panting Obo. The boy was very happy to see Wol and Su. Wabu came over and thought new patients had arrived, but the aide explained that they were his friends. On seeing the healer, the attendant stiffened and raised his hat higher in surprise. While the girls were talking to Obo, he followed Huabu, and catching up with the young man asked if he was the young healer Hua. Huabu confirmed his hunch and in turn asked who the man was. The attendant took off his hat. It was the warrior who had been struck in the Kisen house and saved by the young healer. Wabu remembered him and inquired about his health. All was well thanks to the labors of the healer Hua. The man asked why he had opened a hospital in such a small and poor village. After all, he was rumored to be the most famous healer. But the young man was not embarrassed by the question. It was natural for a healer to be near the sick. Obo praised Mr. Hua's accomplishments to the sisters. They were very surprised at his talent. Everyone moved into the house and continued their conversation around the table. Wol guessed that the boy was studying with Mr. Hua to become a healer. Su was about to say something but was very nervous. Finally, she asked if Huabu could cure a person sick with luz. It was a sexually transmitted disease. In the young man's past life, it was called syphilis. The warrior accompanying the girls shouted for her to be quiet. The affairs of the Qisheng house were not to be told to outsiders, and if Madame found out, Su would be kicked out immediately. The girl was shaking with fear and excused herself for simply telling the gentleman about the patient. She didn't want the girl named Jo Seol to pass away. The attendant clenched her teeth as she said the name of the patient aloud. Wabu friendly urged everyone to calm down and not scare the other patients to begin with. As the healer closed the door, the warrior admitted that he felt sorry for the girl too. But a person infected with this disease was not destined to recover no matter how excellent the skills of a healer were. This disease was incurable. Besides, the girl said the name out loud. Wabu approached them and said he would keep quiet about what he had heard and clarified if he had understood the disease in question correctly. The healer immediately began to inquire about the condition of the patient. He immediately asked about her condition and whether there were any boils on her skin and whether her hair was falling out. Su realized that the young healer knew about this disease and grabbed his clothes. She said that all these symptoms are there and Jo Seol was beautiful when she first came to Qiseng's house, but now she looked really bad. The girl cried and clung to the healer. She knew there was no cure, but there might be a way. Wabu thought intensely. Penicillin could deal with the spirochete as the source of the disease, but it was important to know the symptoms. If it was stage 2, when the skin and mucous membranes were affected, there was hope. But if the bacteria got to the heart and brain, things got more complicated. The most important thing was to find out what the patient's condition was. He replied to the girl still on her knees that he wasn't sure yet, and he needed to see the patient in person. Su was excited that Jo Seol would be saved if the healer visited Qiseng's house, but the warrior asked her to stop. She had no right to invite a healer without Mrs. Ho's permission, and if Mr. Hua comes and the mistress doesn't let him in, it will cause the healer great inconvenience. At this time in the archives, Jiahu Cheng, assistant chief of Chaoxian County, greeted the warlord Cao Cheng. Mr. Cao wanted to review Confucian literature. Xiaohu's assistant praised for such intentions. The craving for knowledge and martial arts had to be balanced. But he didn't bother the warlord because he was going to read quietly and not distract anyone. In fact, Cao Ren was going to find out who was passing the information to the bandits by comparing the handwriting. He was sure it was someone from the magistrate's office. This was the place where the written answers to the examinations of all officials were kept. Comparing the handwritings, Cao hadn't found the right one yet. But even if it took a few days, he had no intention of giving up. His actions were watched by an official who was standing nearby. He realized that the commander suspected something and was about to share his thoughts. Wabu was at home in the courtyard going to practice with the blade given to him. The weapon was amazing and he looked at it admiringly. The first owner of his body was left-handed, but Wabu was good with both hands. It would be nice to carry a blade on each side, but he hadn't learned how to wield a sword properly yet. Wabu wondered how to ask Chao Zhen to train him in the sword arts, since he had already trained him in the heavenly breath streams. Wabun entered the courtyard. He looked exhausted. Wabu rushed to ask what happened to his older brother. Turns out Wabun's mentor had returned, and he needed to train hard to pass the warrior exam in a year. Junior said that his brother must have worked hard and thought to himself that the training had lasted a very long time since his experienced brother was so exhausted. Huabun noticed the sword attached to Huabu's belt. Upon discovering the second blade, the elder brother was greatly surprised. Hwabu held out the sword for his brother to examine it and shared that it had been given to him by Byung-jun. Hwabun was amazed. This sword was light, sturdy, and perfectly balanced. It was worth at least 5 gold pieces. It's unimaginable that a little brother would get it for nothing. Hwabu explained that it was a thank you for treating the blacksmiths. The elder brother asked how many people the young man had cured to receive such gratitude. But when Hwabu admitted that this gratitude was like a gift, Hwabun marveled even more. The younger brother began to list how many people and what he had cured to earn the blade. Hwabun couldn't believe his ears. Hwabu had not only cured several people of tetanus, but had saved a man who was on the verge of death. The older brother thought tensely. The head blacksmith was known for his grumpy temper and would not give such a gift for nothing. The only explanation was successful treatment. Turns out the rumors weren't exaggerations. Everything people said about his brother was an understatement. Hwabu, on the other hand, was pondering that these rumors should be heard by Hwabun. Then he can convince him that he has the knowledge to perform the operation on Mother. Hwabun suddenly asked him to examine his mentor's granddaughter. She was not well, and her brother was only sure that her mentor was looking for a healer for her. But the disease itself was not discussed with anyone and kept secret. And the mentor was aware that the man who cured Warlord Cao of tetanus was Hwabun's younger brother. Hae-su and Hae-wol, also accompanied by a warrior, returned to Ki-seng's house. Mrs. Ho noticed that her elder sister was fresher and decided to let her go to the wake in the village next year. The girl didn't wait for their conversation to be finished and asked the hostess if she knew the healer Hwa. Madame had heard of a healer who was the subject of many rumors. Hae-su admitted that she has seen him in her home village and he knows many of the locals he treats for free. Mrs. Ho confessed that she had heard that this healer was a very interesting character and practiced an unusual medical practice. But she wondered why Hae-su had brought up Hwa's healer. The girl admitted that there were rumors that he could cure Luis. In the archives, a suspicious official was reporting to an angry man about the warlord. He said that Cao Ren was curious about the dungeon master's recent actions. The man was furious because of the action of one brigand, everything had gone wrong. The speaker was ready to immediately deal with the commander as soon as such an order came. But the man noticed that Cao Ren was not so simple, and to end it all, one could either chop off the tail or wound the body. The warlord was the direct heir of the Cao family. He shouldn't have crossed the road. But here, his healer, Mr. Hua, was a better target. According to verified information, Mrs. Cao handed over 100 liang of silver to the healer for the iron spikes. From this information, the man decided that it was the healer who provided the information that exposed him. He was the one who gave the secret information to the robbers. The informer asked only to give the order, and he was ready to destroy the entire Hua family. The traitor decided that this family wasn't worth it, and it was better not to use force. He instructed only the healer himself to bring the head. Mrs. Ho was not happy that healer Hua knew about the illness but asked what he said. The girl recounted Hwabu's words to the amazement of her mistress. She was sure it was a deadly disease. The other girls in the room heard the conversation and began to whisper. Mrs. Ho has seen many healers who have tried to treat this disease with ointments and decoctions, but no one has been able to defeat it. Hae-su confirmed again that healer Hua had not refused treatment and agreed to examine the patient. Mistress Kaiseng pondered. If a beggar healer had said that, she would have called it nonsense, but physician Hua was already a legend. She began to remember everything she had heard about him and what diseases he had cured. Perhaps he really could have saved the girl from this terrible disease. A warrior stepped in and asked to invite Hua's healer to examine the sick woman. It was this young healer who saved him when even the healer Bon refused. The warrior continued that if Mr. Hua could help with this disease, it would be good for the Ki-seng house. Mrs. Ho didn't know what to do. She couldn't leave Jo Seol because she was one of the 3 beauties of Kyoxian. High-ranking men lined up for her attention before her illness. Now the tortured and disfigured girl was alone. She confessed to Mrs. Ho that she no longer had the money and strength for treatment. The unfortunate one didn't want to be a burden to the lady of the house. She clearly wanted to do something terrible to herself while she was in her right mind. But the lady promised to invite a healer and pay for his services. The girl began to work at Kaisen's house in order not to starve to death, so the owner of the house did not want her to die of illness. She couldn't let the girl pass away in the street and asked her to listen carefully. Neither healer Song nor the best healer Tong in Pei County could cure her, but there was bound to be someone who would do it. Mrs. Ho asked Jo Seol not to give up because she was going to fight for her until the very end. The enraged warlord Cao Ren stormed into the courtyard. Clenching his fists, he thought about his meeting with Soban. Cao Ren knew that all the troubles were from this person and couldn't let it go. Since Soban guessed that he had been exposed, the warlord ordered an immediate search for evidence. The commander visited the archives 4 days ago, and since the traitor knew everything, he had an assistant. Cao Ren galloped as fast as possible, pondering who else might be involved. He only saw two people, Gi Dong and Su Dong. Upon reaching the magistrate's office in search of these men, the warlord learned that they had left the building after receiving Soban's orders. He asked the employees where they were headed. One of them saw Su Dong heading towards the bridge. It was about the little bridge outside of town that led to the village of the poor. It suddenly dawned on the warlord that there the healer Hua was receiving his patients. He immediately saddled his horse and rode as fast as he could, for Huabu was in danger. Huabu himself was standing in front of Kaisen's house at this time, thinking that he was seeing him for the first time during the day. Mrs. Ho met the healer and introduced herself. She asked him to proceed to the designated room. Huabu reflected that this was the first time he had met someone who wasn't surprised by his age. He followed Mistress Kaisen down the long hallway. Approaching one of the doors, Mrs. Ho alerted Zhou Seol that a healer had arrived. The sick girl tried to leave the bed to meet Mr. Hua. When she saw her reflection in the mirror, she realized she wasn't going to use it anymore. But she immediately forbade herself to be weak. Zhou Seol had to survive just like Madame said. The girl was worried that healer Hua would also avoid her and be afraid to touch her like other healers. But at this moment, visitors had already entered and Zhou Seol politely introduced herself. Huabu immediately rushed over to her and tried to help her lie back down on the pillows. Mrs. Ho watched the scene contentedly. Huabu proceeded to examine the girl. He started with the boil-covered arm. Zhou Seol felt ashamed, which was unlike her. She usually radiated calmness. Medic Hua clarified that the girl's genitals must be festering badly and causing pain. He explained that this happens most of the time, but also with bleeding. Huabu supported the patient, saying she was doing well. Mrs. Ho was amazed. The other healers didn't say that and didn't mention the symptoms without a full examination. First, the healer had to give an injection of penicillin. He prepared the instruments and the medicine. He warned me it would hurt a little, but he was also concerned about the lack of an allergy test. After giving the injection, he decided to collect material from the skin to analyze. The mistress of the house watched carefully. This healer was not at all like the others. Huabu distracted her from her thoughts by making a request. He held out the medicine and explained that they needed to treat all the wounds on the patient's body, and if he did it himself, the girl would be uncomfortable. Seeing that the woman was wary of touching the patient, Huabu explained that touching her would not make her sick. The young man asked to take care of Zhou Seol and promised to come the next day. Mrs. Ho was pleased. She had never dreamed of having such a healer. Zhou Seol admitted that Mr. Hua had gained her trust. The warlord Cao Ren was rushing towards the village at full speed. He was spotted by two men hiding in the woods. They were on the side of the traders and were going to warn Baekhyun, who had already gone to the village. After writing the note, the men sent a carrier pigeon. Now they needed to join their partner as soon as possible. A tired Huabu had just returned to the poor man's village. Obo's assistant met him and warned him that a sick man was waiting for the healer. The waiting man asked him to save his sick wife. Huabu asked her to bring her, but the visitor replied that he could not bring his spouse. According to him, she complained of such severe dizziness and headaches that she couldn't even walk. So the man asked the young healer to visit her in person. Huabu asked him for his name and address. He planned to find the sick woman himself in the future. The man introduced himself as Baekhyun and said he had a fabric shop in Sodongmak. Baekhyun began urging Huaba to immediately follow his sick wife. The young man pondered. The walk to Sodongmak was about 2 hours, but if the woman couldn't move, it was a serious problem. The man kept begging the healer to come with him. Huabu noticed that there were no other patients and the symptoms were indeed serious and agreed. Hearing this, Baekhyun did his best to hide his smile. Young Mr. Hua followed the man down the path. Before they left, the little helper asked Huaba to take his sword with him. They might be attacked by bandits on the way. The blade was quite heavy and the young man was tired. A pair of homing pigeons flew in the air and one of them landed on Baekhyun's arm. While Huabu was surprised to see homing pigeons, the man took down the note. Baekhyun read and said that the spouse had fainted again and they needed to move faster and suggested taking a shortcut. He turned aside and walked deeper into the forest. Huab had to follow him. The young man noticed that this shortcut is quite steep. On the way, he thought it might be anemia, but strangely enough, he saw a carrier pigeon bringing the news of his fainting. Huabu thought they could take the tract and they didn't need to traverse the mountain. It wasn't just strange, it was even suspicious. Moving behind the man, he noticed that the man's right shoulder was better developed with a narrow waist and strong hips. It was not like the merchant's figure. Noticing all this, Huabu decided to check something out. Hearing a suspicious sound, Baekhyun looked back. He rushed to the young man to find out what had happened, but he pretended to twist his ankle. Huabu held out his hand and asked him to help him stand up. The man held out his hand, and the young healer grasped it tightly. Huabu immediately noted the rough skin on his arm. This hand belonged to a warrior but not a cloth merchant. Before getting up, Hwabu asked to wait and said he needed to give an injection. He decided to strike first to apologize, and it wasn't too late, but he shouldn't have waited to be attacked. He jumped up, pulling his blade from its sheath and preparing to attack. Baek-yoon got his bearings and jumped back. He realized that Hwabu suspected something was wrong because of the pigeon. The man wanted to move farther away so as not to leave any traces, but now he had no choice and drew his sword. And with experienced movements, he rushed towards Hwabu to strike. But Hwabu had not practiced in vain and managed to dodge the blade, and immediately retaliated by catching the shoulder of the attacker. Baek-yoon was perplexed. How could a healer be so good with a blade? Hwabu was very serious and was about to show what it meant to be looked down upon. The young man assessed his opponent's level. It was like Hwabun's, and from the looks of it, Baek-yoon wasn't going to stand on ceremony. Hwabu realized that there was no stalling or he would lose, and immediately rushed into the attack with blow after blow. The man successfully blocked them and guessed that the healer was learning how to use a sword. But deciding that he wasn't a professional, Baek-yoon went on the offense. Hwabu didn't have time to deflect the blow, and the sword had to go straight into his stomach. However, instead of a punch, he felt something strange. Baek-yoon couldn't believe his eyes. The healer, who was standing at a distance from the blow a second ago, jumped back a few meters. He didn't understand how Hwabu could move like that. This skill was only available to masters who had mastered internal chi. The young healer grouped up and rushed at the enemy again. Baek-yoon only had time to have the thought that this person was definitely crazy, and Hwabu had already thrown a punch that the man tried to block. But from the impact, his blade was chopped to pieces. The young man fought with two swords and the opponent didn't stand a chance. Unarmed, he couldn't fend off the attacks and each of the blades reached their target. Finally, the defeated man was on the ground, but he still managed to wound Hwab during the fight. Anosha was glad he was able to dodge using his inner chi, otherwise he would have lost this battle. Despite the painful sensation, Hwabu treated the wound. The cut had to be stitched up as soon as possible. He clenched the branch in his teeth to keep from screaming. Baek-yoon's partners heard the sounds of battle and were sure that he had already dealt with everything. They set out to cover the tracks of the attack on the young healer, but when they reached the battle site, they found only a defeated Baek-yoon. The sight made the men confused. They had been told that Physician Hwa was a lowlife. Hearing a rustle, they turned around and saw Hwaba walking away. The traders readied their blades and rushed after the young man. Hwabu noticed his pursuers approaching him. He began to run away as his wound would not allow him to face two opponents at once. He needed to get out of the forest. There were fields ahead. When he got to the edge of the forest, he started calling out to the people working in the field. The peasants were surprised to see a man there and noticed that he was wounded. The pursuers were getting closer and closer to Hwab, and it was too late to call for help. He tried to run away. If he did nothing at all, the warriors would catch up with him very quickly. The men approached very quickly, still holding their blades at the ready. Hwabu gathered his strength and readied his sword. The traders guessed that if the opponent took up the blade, he was the one who had defeated Baek-yoon and should be careful. The opponents resolutely rushed towards each other, evaluating Hwabu's movements. One of the traders thought it was a standard attack and he would block it and attack immediately. But his blade suffered the same fate as Baek-yoon's. It was shattered. The trader standing behind only watched as his partner fell. He didn't believe that this wounded young man was just a healer. Once again, Hwabu and his opponent froze against each other with their blades ready. Even though the young man was wounded, he was confident in his abilities. The young man took a leap and threw a punch at his opponent. The blow was very strong, but the man did his best to block it. His blade had suffered considerable damage from the impact and might break the next time he was hit. Hwabu had already launched his next attack and with no less force and leaped towards his opponent. The young man realized that his wounded body couldn't handle a prolonged fight, so he needed to gain victory as soon as possible. The blades of the fighting men crossed and the enemy saw Hwabu's sword cut through his weapon. The healer disarmed his opponent and he was left with a broken blade. The man could only stare dazedly at the splintered sword in his hands. Then he rushed to escape. In the current situation, he had no chance of winning. But Hwabu had no intention of letting his attacker go for nothing. A little girl got in the man's way. He realized this was his chance and tried to grab the kid. The fact that the enemy had taken the girl hostage only made Hwaba angrier. The man threatened the young man with the fragment of his sword and ordered him to stop. But Hwabu didn't wait for him to finish and threw his sword at him like a spear. The throw was accurate, and the stricken man fell down, releasing the child. At this moment, Kalren's commander came up and managed to see part of the battle, and now he wondered if this was the healer he knew. He knew Hwabu had a talent for martial arts, but he didn't realize how much. As he dismounted, he approached the wounded young man and asked about his condition. They needed to get back to the village as quickly as possible, and the warlord was going to drive Hwaba. But the young man asked to wait a while and went to the frightened child. He apologized to the crying girl. She was very frightened. Cao Ren watched from afar as Huabu comforted her and asked if she was hurt. The warlord thought this young man was a healer to the core. When they returned to the poor man's village, Obo had helped treat the wound and now it should have healed without complications. Huabu asked the aide to leave them with the warlord so they could talk and the boy left the room. Cao Ren shared what he had learned. The man who was in cahoots with the bandits was now targeting the young healer. Huabu wondered. The traitor had been in the warlord's entourage and had somehow found out about the parchment, and the healer himself was to be eliminated so that he would provide no further information. Cao Ren was going to hire guards for Huabu. The warlord was surprised how he could keep calm and think rationally in such a situation. Meanwhile, Huabu replied that he couldn't always rely on Cao Zhen's guards and had to take care of himself. Then young Master Cao suggested that he learn to wield a sword like the warlord's family. But before ending the conversation, he wondered if there was anything special about the attackers. Huabu thought for a moment. He only remembered the carrier pigeon. It seemed that this fact made Cao Zhen angered Cao Zhen more than a little. To raise such a bird, a lot of money, time, and labor had to be spent, so the traders had a lot of money. The fact that the brigands went up against the county troops indicated a large scale, and the secrecy didn't make them look like ordinary people. Huabu began to ponder again. His help to the warlord had played a cruel trick and now he himself was in danger. Cao Ren rushed to him with promises of 3 guards to be assigned to him. The healer continued to think. Most likely the bandits wouldn't give up and would show up at his house. Worst case scenario, his family gets hurt. To avoid that, you should have attacked first. He suggested that the warlord lure the bandits into a trap. At this time, the traitor from the ministry was enraged that all 3 attackers didn't stand up to the healer. The reporter suggested that Warlord Cao had intervened, and added that he has uncovered some of their people and continues to check the county board. A typing envoy was due to arrive in 10 days. The official hoped to get a prescription for an antidote, and then the next 6 months should pass quietly. But they will still have to listen to a reprimand from the Taiping envoy. The official gave the order to cut off all ends. The speaker specified that many of their people would then be killed. But since Warlord Cao took it upon himself to investigate, casualties were inevitable. To get the official speaker himself and those above to safety, it was necessary to throw about 10 men. But the official had not given up on the idea of massacring the healer Hua and was still waiting for his head. Huabu himself was treating Zhou Suol at this time. The course of treatment was almost over, and the young man thanked her for her fortitude. The girl couldn't believe she was really cured of such a terrible disease. Mrs. Ho rejoiced looking at her ward. She only regretted that Zhou Suol's face couldn't be changed. Suddenly, Huabu said it was time to work on the sores. The landlady didn't believe they could be cured, and Zhou Suol started to cry. She asked how she could repay the healer. Huabu asked her to calm down and told her that he wasn't promising to remove all the sores, but he would try to make it look as good as before the disease as possible. Right now, they should have been focusing on treatment. To begin with, the young healer Hua performed an acupuncture session. Zhou Suol got excited thinking about how much good Huabu had done for her. Mrs. Ho reflected that this young man was very decent. Then she noticed that the girl's face was covered with a blush. Finishing, Huabu turned away embarrassedly so the girl could get dressed. His behavior made Mistress Kaisen laugh because when acupuncture was performed, the healer was not embarrassed. The young man recommended to use lotion from the next day, then the recovery will be faster. It was already sundown when Huabu returned to the village of the poor. He expected to see Bo, but there was a man waiting for him inside. The young man remembered that before he left, the warlord had sent a guard. It was Cao Zhenyagong's assistant. He was now next to Huabu. Even though they had agreed to lure the traders into a trap, the young man was worried about everything going well. The next day, there were no patients. Huabu cured almost all of them. As he walked through the village, he wondered if he could set up a canteen near the hospital. It was starting to get cold and winter was approaching. In a few years, the Yellow Armband Rebellion was to begin, and he would have to treat wounded soldiers. Before this event, he wanted to wander around Zhongyuan and practice medicine. Then he saw a wagon rushing across the bridge at great speed. The man who was driving the horses was yelling for people to clear the road. In the path of the wagon, a boy was playing ball. He looked fearfully at the approaching animals. Without slowing down, the wagon hit the child and sped away. The kid flew off and fell over the bridge. The impact was so strong that his shoes fell off. Huabu clenched his fists with force and rushed to his aid. The wagon drove away without slowing down. The child was far enough away from the young man. He ran up to the boy and began to assess his condition. The baby's father was already coming down the cliff. Huabu asked him to calm down so as not to make things worse. The baby was pale. His pulse was racing, but his body was cold. Feeling Huabu's abdomen, I realized it was a hematocalia. This meant that organs or blood vessels in the stomach had been damaged and bleeding had started. Something had to be done immediately to save the victim. A man came up and asked who was in the path of the wagon. The boy's father realized the man was driving the horses and hit him. He swung with fury to deliver another blow, but the man intercepted his fist and asked him to calm down, then simply pushed the father of the injured boy aside. He may have counted the first hit as an error, but not the second. The man added that such scum should know their place. An order sounded from the wagon to stop what was happening. The man's boss told him to give the money to the child's father and move on. The one obeyed, tossed a sack of money, and advised him to be grateful. Wabu took the baby in his arms and talked himself into calming down. He asked the boy's father to urgently call his assistant Obo. The young man suspected a large vessel had ruptured, and that was a problem. He ran as fast as he could to his hospital with the baby in his arms. Since the patient was very urgent, Wabu instructed Gon to prepare the water. At that time, a wagon drove into the hospital courtyard. A man entered the house and asked where the healer was in a dismissive tone. Wabu replied that if he didn't want to get hurt, he should wait outside. That's the man who hit the baby. The young healer told Mr. Gong that he was busy, and since the man wouldn't leave, asked him to take care of him. The man again disrespectfully asked where the healer was addressing Gon. The one responded by asking who he was and why he allowed himself to talk like that when they first met. Gon clarified why this coachman wants respect since he himself came for treatment in a village where he despises everyone. The man replied that he had brought an important person here and again demanded to know where the healer was. Mr. Gong noticed that the coachman was not at all knowledgeable for someone serving an important person. The healer was what the man called a punk. Wabu continued to examine the child, who had already started crying in pain. The stomach was not to be touched. The best option was to operate near the bleeding. Suddenly, and just in time, the X-ray vision turned on, and the young man saw where the damaged organ was located. At that moment, Obo's assistant ran past the men into the house. Wabu gave the command to urgently prepare for the operation. The coachman realized who the healer was and pushing Gon away tried to walk towards him. He said the baby could be cured later, but right now there's someone he needs to see. But Mr. Gong placed the sword in its scabbard on his shoulder and asked one last time to wait outside. Wabu put on his blindfold and asked Mr. Gong not to let anyone in. The warlord's aide pushed the coachman outside. The disgruntled man was about to hit back and had already clenched his fist. But Mr. Gong threw the coachman off with a kick. No sooner had he attacked again than his master appeared from the wagon and ordered him to stop. The coachman immediately lost his arrogance and began to apologize. Mr. Gong looked at the man and tried to remember where he had seen him. And when he remembered that it was Mr. Guo, he bowed politely. He came from the most influential family in this country. Gon had met him earlier during this man's birthday celebration. Mr. Guo realized that the soldier in front of him was a military man and asked him directly if he was in the service of Commander Chao Zheng. Gon answered in the affirmative and added that he was now assigned to Hua's healer. Guo told him to tell the warlord that the warrior had seen him here and to let him pass to the healer. Mr. Gong had no choice but to let the powerful man inside. Pulling back the curtain on the door, Mr. Guo immediately asked Huabu if he was the healer. The young man replied that he didn't know who he was talking to, but even so, the visitor should have waited outside. He was now treating a patient. This infuriated Mr. Guo to the point where he began to tremble with rage. The fact that he personally went to the healer and did not call the healer at home, and in return he is made to wait, was disrespectful. Wabu listened to the man's accusations perplexedly. At the end, Mr. Guo said that if the healer wanted to live, he should start treating him. The young man did not stop examining the child and told the visitor that he had lose, and advised me to go to the great healer. Mr. Guo became even angrier, but Wabu nonchalantly continued that he could take his life anytime he liked. But under this condition, Mr. Guo himself will also die. The man's disease has moved to the second stage, and the young man described in colors what awaits him in the next 2 months. Mr. Guo listened to the horrors the healer described with clenched teeth. He could have gotten treatment from the best healer. Wabu advised him to do so and say goodbye to life. The young man assured the visitor that this would happen in a couple months at the latest. Clenching his fists and continuing his indignation, Mr. Guo left the hospital. If this healer cured the girl from the Kaizen house of this disease, he should have cured him too. Mr. Guo is planning to get rid of this healer as soon as he's cured. He was already imagining burning down the entire village of the poor along with the people. The more he thought about it, the more resentment he felt. Mr. Guo thought the child's injuries were minor. Getting even more angry, he walked back towards the hospital, planning to strike the warrior who had delayed him. Inside, Huabu was already performing surgery. The boy's colon had been ruptured. Mr. Guo saw the treatment and thought it was crazy. Huabu had already found the bleeding vessel and commanded him to give him a tool. Mr. Guo watched fearfully. He now thought that this healer was dangerous. After that, the influential gentleman left the hospital in a hurry. But at that moment, he needed an urgent visit to the restroom. Looking around, he looked for a place where no one would see him. At last, the gentleman ran quickly toward the forest. Just as the healer had warned, such elemental things caused excruciating pain. After everything was done, Go went in the opposite direction, thinking that if the healer cures this disease, then everything else is not so bad. While he was thinking about putting someone to watch his treatment, the boy's father ran past. The man was worried about his son's condition and asked the healer about it. Wabu pleased the father of the child and replied that the operation was a success. Mr. Guo made his way into the house and stared at the child in amazement. It didn't make sense to him that a healer would cut and then stitch up a man and yet cure him. Wabu came over and asked Mr. Go to lie down on the couch for examination. While the healer was examining the patient thought that he would not take his life because he could be useful. There were rumors of an unknown disease, and Mr. Guo planned to see if the young man could cure it. Having finished examining the patient before he left, Wabu said he had given the patient emergency treatment. But you'll need to come in every day for treatment. Mr. Guo tossed the young man a not insignificant sack of money. Wabu said he could pay after the treatment, but according to the patient, the money was for the performance. It was payment for Mr. Go to see a healer save a life by performing an operation. The wagon drove off and Wabu watched perplexed as Mr. Gong stood bowed. After meeting this powerful man, the young man felt dirty. Gong thought it was a good fortune that a gentleman from the most powerful family had come to Physician Hua for treatment. Wabu remembered that this man ruled over much larger territories, while the Chao family only ruled over a province. Mr. Gong warned the young man to be careful. After all, the recent patient had a nasty temper. Wabu understood that, but he had no choice but to treat Mr. Go. He gave the sack of money he received to Obo and asked him to give it to Dan A's father. The young man did not want to accept this money for treatment and said it was now the village's money. At Kiseng's house, Mrs. Ho stopped by to check on Jo Seol. The woman looked at her ward's face in surprise. It started looking so much better in just a few days. Mrs. Ho realized that Hua's healer was incredible and was very grateful to him for saving the girl's health and appearance. Jo Seol wanted to say something important to the lady of the house. When she recovered, she didn't want to be a kaisen anymore. Mrs. Ho clarified what she would do, because after the treatment, the girl had no money left at all. Jo Seol admitted that she wanted to be a doctor even though she knew that saying that would make a woman laugh. The landlady suspected that this desire was because of healer Hua. She tried to explain to the girl that anyone couldn't become a healer. There was no telling how the young doctor would react. Mrs. Ho was a member of the Hao sect and suggested that Jo Seol join rather than spoil Mr. Hua's future. At that moment, they were alerted to Huabu's arrival. The landlady invited him in and Jo Seol embarrassedly snuggled under the blanket. Wabu explained his early visit by saying he had another house call to make. He needed to visit the flower pavilion of the Kaising house. Jo Seol was frightened and asked if Ran Hua was sick, but the young man didn't know who he was talking about. Mrs. Ho confirmed that Ran Hua has the same disease that the girl was cured of. Jo Seol began to wonder how the healer would treat the new patient, which meant seeing her without her clothes on. But now Wabu was going to treat the sores, and the girl began to prepare herself for the treatment. While the young man was treating the healing sores, Jo Seol reflected that she wanted to help even if she couldn't be by his side. So she decided to join Hao's sect. The girl's main task now is to help Physician Hua. The next day at the hospital, Huabu was satisfied with his work and no more patients were expected for the day. His older brother Huabun came to the courtyard and inquired how the young man was doing. Huabu said that there were many patients in the morning but that he was free in the afternoon. The brother was concerned that if this continued, would Junior be able to maintain the hospital? Huabu replied that he had given money last month to Huaboku's second brother. Huabun didn't know about Huabu's efforts to help them. The younger brother remembered that Huabun should be preparing to give the military exam and asked how he was doing. But the elder brother did not respond and asked to visit a house with him. It was about the master's granddaughter. She had been getting worse lately and had difficulty moving. He said the girl had trouble breathing, but before that it was only during training. Wabu thought it might be a pneumothorax. He needed to gather the necessary things, and they could move out to the sick woman. At the master's house, another healer admitted that he didn't have enough skills to treat the girl. An elderly master blamed himself for his granddaughter's illness. He made her practice and taught her the inner art of Qigong. He suspected she had pulmonary emphysema, and if it spreads, his granddaughter could die. At this time, she met him on the doorstep even though her grandfather had told her to stay inside. He tried to reassure the girl that Huabun's younger brother, who had cured many terrible diseases, was due to arrive soon. So the old man was confident that young Mr. Hua would definitely cure his granddaughter. And now he's just arrived, along with his assistant and his older brother. Wabu politely introduced himself and bowed to the master, who thanked them for their visit. Ban He, the granddaughter of the master, came out to say hello. The young man was impressed by the girl's beauty, but he immediately pulled himself back and reminded himself that he was here for treatment. The master invited everyone to proceed inside the house. When they got to the room, Hwabu proceeded to survey the symptoms. The girl coughed. Even a walk like this was difficult for her. The young man noted to himself that she was tall and thin. This build predisposes her to pneumothorax. First, he was going to listen to her breathing, and for that he pulled the necessary tools from his bag. After applying the homemade device to the patient's back, he noticed that there was shallow breathing in the right lung and the chest did not descend on inhalation. All the symptoms said the girl had a pneumothorax. When asked by the healer when Ban-hee started feeling pain, the master said about a year ago. The patient had to be taken to the village. Hwabu noticed cyanosis when the skin turned a bluish color. Since it showed up so soon after the coughing fit, it was bad. Master asked young healer Hwa what he thought of his granddaughter's condition. Hwabu answered honestly that the girl had pulmonary emphysema and the diseased lung was pressing on her heart. The master was amazed at how the doctor so quickly identified his granddaughter's illness. The young man also said that it was right to stop practicing qigong. The girl urgently needed treatment. Master took Hwabu's hand in his own. He was grateful that the young man wanted to treat his granddaughter, and when asked if he could make her well, the young healer answered in the affirmative. There was no time to delay, and the master gave the order to prepare the wagon. The girl had another coughing fit that made her start choking. Everyone rushed to the bedside of the patient who couldn't breathe. Ban-hee's condition was deteriorating very fast, and it was not good. Hwabu began to listen to the lungs again. There was virtually no breath sounds in the left. This could indicate a tension pneumothorax. He explained to the foreman that the girl's lung was pressing on her heart harder than it could take. Something had to be done immediately. Deputy Obo received a command to urgently prepare alcohol for disinfection. Hwabu apologized because the girl's chest had to be freed from her clothes. But it turns out the ribcage was bandaged. The bandage needed to be removed and Hwabu decided to cut it off. The master asked permission to stay and observe the treatment. He was very worried about his granddaughter and could hardly stay outside. Hwabu pulled out the injection devices and prepared to begin. But before doing so, he warned Obo to watch the process carefully. The young healer was about to make a puncture between the second and third rib under the collarbone. They should have heard the sound of air escaping. The assistant carefully watched and listened to Mr. Hwa's explanations, while the master tensely watched the manipulations with worry, clenching his knees. The old man had heard of this healer but had never seen such methods in his life. Hwabu was about to make an incision and asked his assistant to prepare the cautery. Master thought that he was very lucky to take Hwabun as an apprentice and to know such a healer. Hwabun himself was waiting outside and was nervous about whether everything was all right there. After all the procedures, Hwabu announced that the operation was a success. He explained to the grandfather that after a day, the blood and pus should stop coming out, and then the tube should be tied. But the master was worried that he might not be able to handle it, so he asked healer Hwa to perform the procedure himself. Hwabu was happy to agree at first, but remembered that the overbearing and fiery Mr. Go was coming. He tried to describe the situation to the master, who immediately realized that it was most likely a very high-ranking person. Still, young healer Hwa promised to come the next day. Their dialogue was interrupted by shouts coming from outside. The master swung the doors open, trying to figure out what that noise was. One of the students grabbed Mr. Gong, whom he thought was suspicious. Hwabu tried to explain that it was his guard. Hwabun heard those words. He was frightened why his little brother needed a guard. Hwabu was slow to answer, trying to find the right word. Hwabun was very angry that his brother didn't share with him. The master interrupted the brothers' quarrel, and though he did not know what had happened, he was indebted to them, and offered an apprentice as a guard. 2 guards were better than 1. He commanded his disciple to be rad with young Master Hwa. That one had already heard of Hwabun's younger brother and was happy to meet him. It wasn't just a student, but Ban's older brother. His name was Yu Jin. From his past life, Hwabu remembered that this young man would later become a general who would stabilize the distant lands. The great Yu Jin of the Troy era now had to guard him. When darkness fell, the Taiping envoy and the traitor official met. The messenger was not happy. The messenger had failed to control a small town and had killed 10 people to cover his tracks. Hua Dan clarified that she was definitely talking to the Mr. Yui she knew. He couldn't even get rid of a simple healer yet and used human resources to do so. For Viceroy Taiping Yuya, the best thing was for his plan to eliminate young Master Hua to work. Mr. Yu asked Hua Dan if she knew Mr. Gocho from Pei State. She knew and had a very poor opinion of the man. Yu admitted that he wanted to ambush him and set up an attack by the military. Then there will be disagreements between families and military personnel. Hua Dan smiled. If everything went as planned, things were going to improve in Chohung. And to stage this rebellion, Mr. Yu planned to use the healer Hua. Messenger asked for more detail on how he is going to do this. Mr. Guo had to be treated by a healer and take a maximum of 3 guards with him, so getting rid of him was no problem. If things were as Mr. Yu described, then this was indeed their chance. The typing viceroy expected to carry out this operation in the next few days. With these words, he reassured the messenger and she handed him the box. In response to the words of gratitude, Huadan promised that if everything works out, the gifts will become more significant. In the meantime, it had already gotten quite cold, and a snowy winter had set in. In the poor man's village, Huabu looked at the falling snow and thought about the fact that it had fallen quite a lot. The unpleasant Mr. Guo was expected to come for treatment. Eugene shared with Huabu that he would gladly do away with this gentleman. He earned this attitude by his behavior as he pushed other patients away and always demanded to be treated first. This time Mr. Guo was late, and Huabu thought it was all the fault of the snowfall. The patient's carriage was approaching. The gentleman himself finally felt the disease begin to recede. He was definitely getting better and even had reduced pain. He shuddered to remember how long he'd had to endure up to this point. Mr. Go admitted that Physician Hua is arrogant but talented. He just needed to utilize this young talent in the right way. Suddenly, an arrow flew through the wagon window and stuck not far from his head. It was an ambush. Arrows were flying from all sides. One of the warriors accompanying the wagon told the coachman to take the lord to safety. The coachman understood the task and spurred the horses to get away as quickly as possible. Mr. Guo struggled to keep his balance, unable to think who dared to attack him like that. One of the arrows hit right in the thigh of one of the horses. The frightened animal stood on its haunches. The coachman tried to hold the reins. But the wagon didn't stay on the road and overturned. The road was on the edge of a cliff, and the coachman was thrown out in its direction. Mr. Guo remained inside the falling wagon. Falling off the cliff, she flipped over several times. On the last impact, the wheels flew off and the walls broke. The coachman had been thrown back earlier and could see the wreckage of his wagon. Despite being wounded, he rushed forward calling for his master. Wabu was at the hospital still waiting for a patient who promised to come every day. He even asked the other patients to come at another time. At that time, Gon's guard entered the house. He didn't like that Mr. Go was late and offered to check what was wrong. Someone was approaching the house calling loudly for healer Hua. The coachman carried the injured Mr. Guo on his back and asked for urgent help. Wabu rushed to help. The injured man had to be put on the bed. The wound at the top of his head was bleeding profusely. The coachman said they were ambushed and the wagon fell off a cliff. Upon removing the bandage, Wabu discovered that the temporal artery had been severed. He also had a dislocated hip. The young man ordered the coachman to bind his master's limbs. He then tried to give the victim a drink of anesthesia, but he inadvertently knocked the bottle away with his hand. It flew off and shattered. All the anesthesia ended up on the floor. There was no choice, and it was necessary to act even without anesthetic. Wabu pushed an improvised gag into Mr. Go's mouth. After putting on the bandage, the young healer warned that he would operate without anesthesia. While the coachman and Mr. Gong held the injured man's legs, Assistant Oh Bo helped Huab perform the operation. The guards standing outside listened to the screams coming from the room. The coachman was worried about whether or not everything would definitely be all right, but Huabu asked him to stay focused and hold the lord tightly. At last, the operation was finished, and the young man reassured the terrified coachman that Mr. Guo had fallen asleep. Mr. Yu apologized to the envoy that they failed to eliminate Mr. Guo. Hua Dan was fine with that too. Everything was fine as long as the victim thought it was the military ambushing him. She believed that this irascible man should survive to stand up to the military. It will be hard enough for them to prove their innocence. And a rather plausible insignia was left at the ambush site. Now the conspirators had only to sit and wait. At the hospital, Huabu was on duty about the bedside of an operated patient. Finally, Mr. Guo woke up from his sleep and opened his eyes. Yu Jin was on duty outside the building. The rest of the soldiers could not be seen. The patient immediately began to resent the work of her guard. Listening to his cries, Huabu nonchalantly prepared the acupuncture tools. While Mr. Guo threatened to straighten everything out, the young man put his skills to use. It worked, and the violent patient went back to sleep. Young Wan, the Go family's personal physician, saw it. Huabu explained his actions by saying that he couldn't let the vessels burst from the strain. Zhang Wan watched the healer, who looked no more than 15 years old. He also didn't understand how it was possible to connect the vessels and save a person. He was also amazed at how this young man was able to cure Luis so quickly. Zhang Wan even thought Huabu was the reincarnation of Emperor Yandi. A little later, Captain Piong was reporting to his master what had happened on the road. They thought it was a military ambush and assassination attempt. In the captain's opinion, the attackers were well trained as soldiers. The arrows and bows were also military-like, but the important evidence was the insignia found. Huabu thought that one would have to be quite stupid to use distinguishing marks on a fence. He realized that someone wanted to make a fuss, but he didn't know who. Mr. Guo jabbed his finger at Mr. Gong because he was also a military man and demanded the insignia from him. After comparing the two signs, the victim concluded that they were exactly the same. And then he demanded an explanation from Mr. Gong. The military officer tried to explain that anyone can forge such a sign, and one cannot be completely sure that the attackers belong to the army. Mr. Go ordered Captain Pyong to arrest Gong immediately. Yu Jin intervened into the conversation. He understood that Mr. Guo was very angry, but he asked him not to take it out on the innocent. At these words, the high-ranking patient became even more furious. When asked who he was, Yu Jin replied that he was Dr. Hua's security guard. Mr. Go noticed that there's something wrong with that guard. He had an unusual aura and was able to keep his composure while objecting to such a person. After assessing all of this, he asked Yu Jin who his master was. But the man replied that he couldn't divulge it even to Mr. Guo. But he showed his sword and said that the Lord would understand when he saw this blade. Mr. Guo froze in astonishment. It was the judge's sword. He started to loudly express his respects, but Yu Jin quickly shut his mouth. There were a lot of ears around and it wasn't worth revealing details. Mr. Guo realized he had to give in. This sword was given by the emperor himself. Then he coughed and said that he had lost his temper because of his illness. And if he went against the army, no good would come of it. Yu Jin agreed. There was no need to make a fuss in the treatment center. Huabu watched this in surprise. It seemed to him that Mr. Guo almost bowed. Who was Master Yu Jin that he had such an influence on people? A little later, Huabu arrived at Qi-Seng's house and was told that Zhou Seol had a stomachache, but that was just an excuse for Hua's healer to come. Zhou Seol talked about the Taiping mansion that was frequented by those suspected warlord Chao and the warriors who attacked Huaba. She became suspicious and handed the list to the young healer. The Taiping meant the army of yellow armband. The girl didn't have exact information, but the place seemed extremely dubious. Huabu pondered that the Hao sect had reliable information and it should be passed on to whoever needed it. But to whom exactly? Should he have shared it with the warlord Chao? While Huabu was doing that, Cao Ren could fight with Mr. Guo. After thanking the women, the young man was about to leave Qi-Seng's house. Before he left, he promised to treat them to something when it was over, which delighted Zhou Seol. At the hospital, Mr. Go told Young Won what diseases the young healer Hua was able to cure. The healer was very surprised. Such illnesses could not be cured by a mere skillful child. He had never heard of anyone being able to cope with even one of the ailments, and Huabu was able to cure all four. Mr. Guo was thinking that the young healer must have been more amazing than he imagined. And this young man was guarded by a man with a judge's sword. Suddenly, he thought that the healer had saved his life twice himself. It turns out he owed a huge debt to this young man. The next day, Huabu was seeing new patients. They were emaciated and only good nutrition could help, but he could not give money to such patients all the time. Seeing the sick off, the young man thought about how to find a way to help them. Bowing his head, he walked over to Mr. Guo, resting on the bench. The one asked what the reason was for the healer sighing so heavily. Huabu surprised Mr. Guo by suddenly asking if he could buy grain from him. The Lord thought it was for the Huabu family. He had heard earlier that they were in decline and was just going to give as much as he needed. But the young healer surprised him even more by replying that the grain was not for him. There were many hungry people in the village, and to avoid buying grain in the winter, it had to be done now. Mr. Go noticed that grain for the whole village would be expensive. Was Huabu really going to spend the money he'd paid him? Young healer Hua was exactly what he was going to do. This made Mr. Go laugh. He had no way of predicting Huabu's actions. Zhang Wan was startled when he heard his master promise to give the grain away for free. Huabu was very happy to hear this and asked if Mr. Guo was joking. The man didn't think he was joking. He immediately ordered Zhang Wan to take some soldiers and bring the grain to the village. The young man was nervous that it would take quite a lot of grain, but Mr. Guo asked him not to worry about it. Healer Hua's concern now was to think of how to cure Mr. Go. The next day, there were many bales of grain in the courtyard of the hospital. Surprised residents flocked to the courtyard. The soldiers asked the villagers to line up and come one by one. There was enough grain for everyone. Yu Jin watched in surprise and wondered if a person could change like this after being hit on the head. There were many people standing in line. Dan A and his father were among them. Mr. Go noticed the boy who was hurt by his coachman. He ran up to the warrior distributing the grain and ordered him to give them 3 times as much. Dan A's father could take as many as 6 bags. He began to thank Mr. Guo and then pretended that nothing significant had happened. Zhang Wan noticed that his master was acting strangely, but to Huabu's eyes, he was much more like him than he was arrogant and flamboyant. Physician Zhang Wan had served Mr. Go for over 20 years, but this was the first time he had seen him like this. Most likely the influential man was so impressed by Hua's healer skills, but those words confused Huaba. Who was he to impress people? It's better to let this difficult patient slowly get better. At the house, Mr. Go asked if Huabu could tell him anything after curing him. The young man asked if they had managed to catch those who had ambushed him. Huabu said that he had information, but he was not completely sure. He didn't tell it before because he wanted to hear everything and not what he wanted to hear. Mr. Guo promised to be reasonable. Huabu told everything he knew about Taiping Manor. After listening, Mr. Guo was determined to sort things out on his own. But Huabu advised to investigate the matter with Warlord Cao. Mr. Guo promised to give the healer a good reward if the manor really turned out to be a den of thugs. Huabu started to refuse, but his interlocutor believed that every action had its price. And when the young man agreed, Mr. Guo went to meet the warlord. But the young healer asked him to delay and consider a plan of action. Later, Mr. Guo, accompanied by his soldiers and with Mr. Gong bound, stood in front of the ministry and angrily demanded Warlord Cao Zheng. He was just coming out of the building and asked what was going on. Mr. Guo pushed the bound Gong to the ground and accused the warlord of assault. Cao Zheng bypassed the steps and immediately rushed to meet him. The angry gentleman continued to shout at the commander and urged him to confess what he had done. One of the soldiers watched everything carefully and then cautiously headed for the exit. His quick departure was noticed by Mr. Guo's guard. He immediately reported it while he continued to accuse the warlord. Cao Ren didn't understand what was going on and why his interlocutor changed his tone and became distracted. But he remembered how the healer Hua had suggested he set a trap for the intruders. Realizing what was going on, he suggested that Mr. Guo go inside and discuss things over a cup of tea. The escaped military officer reported to Mr. Yu Yu and Hua Dan that Mr. Guo had broken into the prefecture building. The Taipian envoy was pleased. This action was like their plan. She thanked Mr. Yuya for doing a great job. Qiao Jia was now walking straight into their hands. Warlord Cao, along with his soldiers, was already in front of the manor building. Without ceremony, he kicked in the front door with one foot, burst into the room and ordered the soldiers to grab everyone in the room. The Taiping envoy and Mr. Yu didn't expect to be visited by soldiers. Hua Dong shouted to the confused viceroy to pull out the stash. She told him to hurry before the soldiers blocked the exit. The defenders of the manor fled to meet the invading warlord. Now the real battle was about to begin. The commander has given orders to take the lives of anyone who resists. After emptying the stash, Mr. Yu and Hua Dong tried to escape in a secret tunnel. The viceroy knew the way and pointed the way to where they should run. There was a locked door in front of them. They could have tried to escape through that exit. Mr. Yu tried to unlock the lock. The envoy was already beginning to doubt the success of her escape. The viceroy didn't have the key, though he knew for a fact that he had tucked it away in a secret pocket. The woman trembled with rage. How could he have lost the key? Now, they wouldn't be able to leave the manor. They went back in and had to fool the soldiers and find another way out. Hua Dong started tearing at her clothes, and when the viceroy tried to ask why, told him to shut up. After that, she ordered her to be tied to a pole and Mr. Yu Yu himself to take her things and try to escape. Hua Dong planned to buy time. In the belongings, the Taiping viceroy discovered a box. While the woman instructed him that they didn't know each other, he hid what he found in his clothes. The soldiers were approaching the room where the conspirators were. Mr. Yu only had time to hide behind the door and watch from there. Through the secret passage, he headed back toward the locked door. He's had the key all along. He pretended to lose it on purpose to break his contract with the messenger. As he looked at the key, the viceroy thought that he should make sure that he wouldn't see Hua Dong again. Finally, Mr. Yu unlocked the lock and followed along. Beyond the door, the tunnel continued, but there were still weapons there. The fugitive took a bow with him. So, with the treasure from the stash and his bow, he left the secret passage and no longer planned to interfere with the peace order. Before leaving this place, Mr. Yu took one more look at the Taiping Manor. Inside, arrests were made of everyone the soldiers found. The servicemen calmed down Hua Dong, who was pretending to be a victim. They believed her deception and could do no harm. Now she had to figure out a way to escape. She blamed the viceroy for these events. But the arrow didn't let her finish her thought and stabbed right into her ribcage. The military had no time to react and only watched the wounded girl fall. They prepared to repel the attack and loudly warned the others of the ambush. But the arrow was fired by Mr. Yu sitting on a tree branch. Yujin told his mentor how Mr. Guo had distributed the grain. The young man thought it was the master's way of making a good impression on the master. Master was not in agreement with this. If Master Guo was afraid of the judge's sword, he wouldn't have spoken rude words. The reason was different. It was probably Hua's healer who had saved his life twice. Anyway, the important thing was that he did a good thing that no one expected. Bun He heard Grandpa say that Hua's healer had changed that man. Yujin also said that the healer Hua was talented in martial arts, which surprised the master very much. Turns out, they sparred with each other, and the healer practiced every day. What amazed the master even more was that Huabu had put chi energy into his sword. Yu Jin added that it was Warlord Cao who trained the young healer in the family art, but it hadn't been more than 5 months since the training began. The master's granddaughter stood at the door and listened intently to the whole conversation. She thought Hua's healer was amazing too. Even though they were the same age, she sometimes felt like they weren't. Bunhee thought she wanted to talk to the healer the next time he came over. Huabu was at this time resting on a bench in the courtyard of his hospital. As he had hoped, the grain helped, and so far, no patients with exhaustion had come to him. A herbalist passed by. Huabu asked if he had gone to the mountains and asked him to be careful. Patients recently treated for exhaustion also looked much better. Huabu thought contentedly that everyone was revitalized and they could survive this winter. The problem of ambushing Mr. Guo was also solved, and he was no longer angry. But Huaba was distracted from his pleasant thoughts by the clatter of hooves. Eldest brother Huabun drove into the courtyard at breakneck speed. He came so urgently because their mother was in serious condition. Huabu went inside the house and asked the aide to get ready. But his hands were shaking a lot himself. Maybe his body was reacting to his mother's illness. But the spirit that inhabited this body asked not to worry. Now it was his mother too. He was confident he'd do the surgery successfully. The sick mother's condition was monitored by healer Bon and elder brother Huabok. Huabok asked the healer in desperation if there was another way out. But as the pain in the woman's stomach was returning, Bon answered in the negative. Physician Bong confessed that only one person could cure this disease, and that was Physician Hua. And just at that moment, Huabun brought his younger brother. Huabok didn't believe the younger brother could handle it, and asked the healer Bong again if that was definitely the case. To this, the healer replied that if Huabu fails, no one can cure this disease. The younger brother, accompanied by his assistant and Huabun, entered the room. He immediately proceeded to examine the mother, and began by checking her pulse. Healer Bon said he used acupuncture to put the patient to sleep. Otherwise, she suffered from pain and nausea. Huabu determined that mother had a very high fever. Her condition was indeed serious. He noticed the woman's abdomen was distended, which it shouldn't be, and wished he had X-ray vision. Huabu was thinking so intensely about the appearance of this ability that his heart began to beat very fast. After that, he immediately started seeing through X-rays. The cause of the severe condition was acute cholecystitis. He shouted to Huabok that mother was in critical condition and surgery was needed immediately. If left to her own devices, she can't survive. Huabok thought intensely. He remembered what he had heard about his brother's skills. Then he made the decision to entrust mother's treatment to his younger brother. Meanwhile, she briefly came to her senses and called out to Huaba. She said she heard her youngest son saved a lot of people. Huabu confirmed that it was all true. Then the woman asked why he looked so worried. She herself was relieved to be treated by her own son. Those words calmed Huaba, and he promised to do his best to make her feel better. They prepared for the operation. Physician Bon and assistant Obo were to assist. Huabu was setting himself up for success, and the operation shouldn't be difficult. Obo happily noticed how young healer Hua's mood had changed. He became centered, determined, and confident. Taking a scalpel in hand, Huabu told the assistants that he was beginning the operation. To cauterize the cut, Obo was already holding a red-hot poker at the ready. Huabu asked Bon's healer to hold and open the flesh. The senior healer admired not only Huabu, but also his assistant. The child kept his composure in such a difficult situation. This boy was like the hands and feet of healer Hua. Healer Bon also noticed that Huabu was also behaving unusually differently than when he was rescuing wounded soldiers. It was as if his hands knew what to do. Right now, Huabu looked like a god in the flesh to him. The operation continued. The young healer had already gotten rid of the mesentery. He had to disconnect the open bile duct, but blood spurted. Wiping his face, he instructed his assistant to clean up the blood and prepare a poker. After several manipulations, the bleeding was stopped. Having done the cauterization was finished with the most dangerous part of the operation. Huabu really hoped he had done the right thing. But there was a lot of work ahead and he had to save mother. Outside, the brothers languished outside waiting. It had been a long time and they were nervous. Huabun continued to be nervous despite Huabok's soothing tone and the fact that his younger brother was performing the surgery. Huabok focused on the thought that his brother would definitely cure mother. But he kept begging for her recovery, hoping it wasn't too late. Finally, the door swung open and the brothers froze in anticipation of the news. A haggard Huabu came out to them. His clothes were covered with drops of blood. After a short wait, he announced that the surgery was a success. The brothers exhaled and began to smile happily. Huabu started to say that mother was fine as he suddenly became dizzy. The older brothers rushed to the fainted young man. That's when the healer Bon came up and asked to take a look at the young man. Oh Bo's assistant worriedly asked what was wrong with Hwa's healer, but Bon reassured everyone. It seemed Hwa Bu had just fallen asleep from exhaustion. While the body was resting, Jinsu Han's spirit found itself in an unknown place. He looked around, not realizing where he was. Out of the darkness, the spirit of his current body was approaching him. The spirit bowed low before Jinsu Han. It seems to be his way of expressing his gratitude for saving his mother. The young surgeon's spirit assured him that all was well now. Then he reached out and patted the boy's shoulder reassuringly. Suddenly, that one began to emit bright rays of light. Jinsu Han watched as the spirit disappeared in that light. He asked the vanishing soul not to be disturbed any longer. Wabu came to his senses on a pillow in the bed and tried to figure out what was going on. Remembering his mother's surgery and communicating with the spirit, he immediately jumped up. Looking at his hands, he wondered if it was a dream or reality. Looking around, he noticed that his bed was next to his mother's. The woman slept peacefully after the successful surgery. Wabu thought it worked out very well. The worried brothers looked into the room and asked how he was feeling. The young man replied that both he and his mother felt fine. Hwabok put his hand on his younger brother's shoulder and apologized for not believing in him earlier. And without holding back his sobs, he thanked me for saving his mother. A few days later, Hwabu examined his mother and noted that the wound had healed. She should be fully recovered soon. He explained to the assistant that what was left was to remove the drainage tube and stitch it up once the intestinal juices were clearer. Healer Bong was watching the conversation and noticed that Oh Bo, even though he was a child, was the right hand of Healer Hwa. Right now, Hwabu was a divine healer, but in the future, that role was reserved for Obo. The healer regretfully thought that if he had been younger, he would have gladly become a disciple of Healer Hwa. But he had a nephew who wanted to study medicine. An unfamiliar man came into the room and asked where Healer Hwa was. Wabu replied to the stranger that the healer was him. The man then said that a letter was addressed to him and handed over the paper. The young healer took the letter. The visitor was a messenger from the Chancellor. Wabu began to read the letter carefully. Hwabok watched him. Mother asked if Chancellor was asking to meet him. It was really true. Hwabok exulted with delight. The healer Bon told Mother Hwab that he had cured Mr. Guo's ailment not long ago, and Mr. Go's niece was the Chancellor's third concubine. That's probably how he heard about Physician Hwa. Mother still couldn't believe that her youngest son had been written to by the Chancellor himself. The letter said to report to the Yinchuan Commandery. It seems the Chancellor asked to visit the sick man. Healer Bon suspected that it might be because the third concubine had recently become pregnant. Wabu was horrified. He had not taken a course in gynecology and obstetrics in his past life. The mother called her youngest son by his adult name, Bu. When he turned to her, Mother said she was proud. She urged Hwaba to hurry up and cure whatever disease was there. He obediently agreed even though he wasn't sure. It was not in his competence. A short while later, Hwabu was already in Yinchuan Commandery. Go Hyun's honorable concubine hidden behind a veil said that uncle often talked about him. Hwabu was honored to meet Go Hyun. The maid handed him the silk thread that came from Madame, and Go Hyun asked him to take care of the examination. Hwabu took the thread in his hands. Did they really want to check the pulse through it? He remembered seeing moments like this in movies in his past life. But now he had to do something he'd only seen on TV. Clenching the thread in his fist, he thought that this was beyond his skills and he was not capable of accomplishing it. Bowing his head, he apologized to the venerable concubine, and frankly admitted that he lacked the skills for such an examination. At the end, adding that there should be no shortcomings when examining patients. Go Hyun didn't know what to do. Her uncle insisted that it was the physician who should examine her, but the Chancellor's permission was required for a routine examination. Hwabu was taken aback when the concubine mistress replied in agreement. She promised to ask the Chancellor for permission. The young healer waited patiently in a special room. It took time to get the permit, and he enjoyed the tea party. He was impolitely called out and asked if he was the boy who would be examining Her Highness. It was the court physician Kyung Gok, who had explicitly stated that in order to get closer to Hwabu's court, he had used connections through Mr. Go. Kyung Gok wanted to see how amazing this young man was since he came to treat Her Highness. The court physician knew that Hwabu was unable to examine the honorable concubine with the thread. Kyung Gok was about to teach a lesson, but the fact that the young healer didn't know how to use the thread already indicated where he was at. Hwabu replied that he would probably go on about his business if the healer had finished speaking. The court physician was taken aback by these words of some boy. But just as he was about to say something offensive, a maid came in and summoned Hwa's physician. The Chancellor gave his permission for the examination. Kyung Gok looked at the departing young man and then decided to follow him. Hwabu found himself once again in front of Her Highness, who was still hidden by her veil. Bowing his head, the young healer unhappily wondered why the court physician had followed him. Kyung Gok asked Go Hyun's permission to look at the treatment to gain new knowledge. She graciously allowed it. Hwabu suspected that the court physician was going to follow him. Walking up to Go Hyun, the young man warned that his ways of inspection were different from what she was used to. The girl asked him not to worry and to do as he knew how. Through the veil, Hwab thought her belly was too bloated, but he had been told that the girl had more spots and freckles. Go Hyun admitted that she's been tired and sleeping a lot lately. She also had lower back pain and her cycle ended more than 3 months ago. From the description, these were typical pregnancy symptoms. He asked permission to check for a pulse. But there was something wrong with him. There was no steady pulse. Hwabu didn't know if he could diagnose by pulse alone. Perhaps he could use his powers. Go Hyun realized that the doctor was confused and said that her body had weakened since she hadn't been able to eat properly lately. The young man thought that if it wasn't a pregnancy and he misdiagnosed it, there would be a big fuss and trouble. The court physician watched the young healer carefully, and since Hwabu didn't answer Her Majesty's question for quite some time, even got nervous. He didn't wait for the young man to say the diagnosis out loud, and told the girl that she was expecting a child and offered a potion of herbs. Hwabu looked back at the court physician unhappily. It took time to look around, but we had to hurry. There was only one way out. Hwabu concentrated and tried to turn on his X-ray vision. He used it to see that the girl wasn't expecting a baby. It was a false pregnancy. Things got complicated. The court physician didn't understand why this boy was hesitant. Then he turned to Her Highness and tried to humiliate Hwaba. According to him, even though the young healer was recommended by Mr. Guo, it was impossible for a person of such a young age to master the skills of medicine. He again offered to give the girl the potion to give birth to a healthy baby, but Hwabu couldn't stand it and interrupted him. The young man turned to Kyung-gok and asked if he had ever examined Go Hyun and checked her pulse. The court physician was outraged at how the boy dared to doubt his diagnosis since he was the head of the court physicians. To which Hwabu remarked that this was not the place for such talk. After these words, he asked Her Majesty's permission to interrupt briefly. After getting permission, Hwabu went down the stairs to the court healer. He invited Kyung-gok to continue their conversation outside since there were many ears here. The court physician was not going to believe Hwabu's statement that Her Highness was not pregnant. After all, her belly was already visible. Hwabu tried to explain that he was too big for such a small term, but Kyung-gok believed it was possible if the baby was healthy. Finally, the young healer said that he examined the girl and the court. Healer didn't even check her pulse. Without that, it's extremely difficult to make a diagnosis. Kyung-gok smirked and said that an experienced doctor could determine the disease just by looking at the patient, but Hwabu was too young and inexperienced. False pregnancy is a psychological illness and was passed by convincing a woman she wasn't pregnant. But at the time, there were no tests or ultrasounds. That was why Hwabu was trying to convince the court healer to use his authority in making the diagnosis. But the stubborn and smug Kyung-gok was convinced otherwise. Hwabu tried to persuade him to check the girl's pulse, but the court healer could tell many illnesses just by looking at her and would not agree. Besides, he was not allowed to touch Her Highness. Someone came up and hearing them talking asked if the baby was really gone. It was Go Hyun herself who demanded an answer from physician Hwa. Standing behind her was Chen Gui, the Chancellor of Pei State. The healers introduced themselves and bowed respectfully. The Chancellor asked about Hwaba, if he was recommended by the head of the Go family. The young man once again introduced himself and answered the question in the affirmative. Chen Gui asked what the exact diagnosis was. Hwabu had no choice but to reveal the truth, and he replied that because of the woman's strong desire to conceive a child, she made up the pregnancy. The mind wanted it, but the body was wrong. The diagnosis was a psychotic disorder bringing on the feeling of pregnancy. It was the first time the Chancellor had heard of such a disease and asked Kyung-gok if he had heard of such a thing before. The court physician replied that he had never seen any mention of the disease in books. It could not have existed in this era. Chen Gui clarified to Hwabu whether he had realized this only by checking Her Majesty's pulse. After receiving an affirmative answer, the Chancellor decided to let another healer examine Go Hyun. That would be fair. Hwabu agreed, thinking that if Kyung-gok still claimed that the girl was pregnant after the test, he was a real charlatan. But if the young healer's diagnosis was wrong, he would have to answer for his words. At the palace, the court physician warned that he was starting to check the pulse of the honorable third concubine. After getting permission, he took the girl's hand and started counting her pulse. Gun-gyuk noticed that his pulse was very weak. It shouldn't be like this. But the belly was so big it was like there were twins inside. He really didn't like it, but by outward symptoms it was still a pregnancy. In the end, Gun-gyuk decided that he could take it back whenever he wanted. For him, the main thing was to teach the young healer Hwa a lesson. On appealing to the Chancellor, the court physician said the pulse was weaker than it should be. But he claimed with certainty that the girl was pregnant. The Chancellor invited other court physicians to examine her. They all confirmed the pregnancy. Hwabu watched in horror at what was happening. and resented that the chief court physician had gathered quacks around him. Chen Gui asked all the healers if they were sure of their diagnosis. All of them confirmed their answer. They couldn't contradict Gong Yuk and wanted to leave this room quickly. The chancellor turns to Huab. All the court healers refuted his diagnosis. Gong Gyok rejoiced. The young healer, who had no milk on his lips, would no longer doubt the chief physician of the court, and anticipated the Hua boy being trampled into the dirt. The court physician asked Her Majesty's permission to give her judgment. After getting permission, he said that the young healer may have just made a mistake, but he was worried that Huabu was unhappy with the pregnancy and might harm the baby. After these words, young Mr. Hua was thrown behind bars. Knowledge of medicine came out the side of his mouth and led to a contempt charge. Sitting in his cell, he began to suspect it was all planned. You couldn't even call such people healers. Adding to the anxiety was the thought that mother would be very worried when she learned that her youngest son had been locked in a dungeon. And if it weren't for Mr. Guo's troubles, the punishment would have been much harsher. At such a charge, Wabu could have lost his hands or even his life. Someone was approaching the cell, calling loudly for the healer. A worried Obo's aide worried about his condition. Wabu thought the boy had gone back, but he couldn't do that when he learned of the healer's arrest. He told Obo that he shouldn't suffer here with him, but Huaba was comforted by the thought that since the assistant had not returned home, his mother had not found out. The aide winked slyly and asked the healer Hua if he had eaten anything. After that, handed him a dish filled with food. Obo was on good terms with the guards, and if Huab needed anything, he could tell him. The young healer thanked the boy and shared his food with him, holding out a chicken leg. The boy started to refuse, but Huabu tried to change his mind by saying his arm was tired, and he can throw away that chicken leg if Obo doesn't eat it. After they had eaten everything on the plate, the boy asked if he should tell Mr. Go about Huaba being locked up. The young man considered this option, but Mr. Guo couldn't help it. The chancellor was very much like him, and they informed Mr. Go that young physician Hua was locked up in prison. When he received the news, he wondered what could have gone wrong. It was his plan to have Huabu simply diagnose the problem by doing a good deed. And if the chancellor had liked Huabu, he would have been appointed a civil servant despite his background, but instead, he ended up in prison. Mr. Go asked about Assistant Obo how the healer Hua came to be imprisoned. When he heard the answer, he was surprised that his niece was not pregnant, but believed it as the healer had a straightforward character. Mr. Go didn't know what to do. He had just been recognized by his brothers and he wanted to help Huab, but he couldn't stand up to the chancellor himself. Obo distracted him from his thoughts by saying that Huabu had a request to pass on. At the palace, the chancellor summoned the court physician to ask him some questions. He inquired if the spouse's condition had improved. Gong Gyok bowed down and replied that the girl's body was naturally weak and the treatment was slow. A quick recovery could be disastrous. Waiting for the next question, the court healer began to worry why the chancellor had started asking about the concubine's condition. The chancellor asked the next question. He was interested in the sex of the child. The court healer did not expect such a question and hesitated to answer. Finally, he said that it was difficult to say now and it would be more precise when the term was longer. The chancellor then inquired whether other healers should have this skill. Upon hearing an affirmative answer, Chen Gui ordered all the court healers to gather in the palace and check the bullets of the honorable third concubine in 5 days. After that, they should have determined the sex of the baby. The chief court healer didn't understand what was going on but was very concerned. Mr. Guo told the brothers that the court physician was trying to determine the sex of the unborn child. With his skills, it shouldn't be difficult. If they wanted to save physician Hua, there was no other way. There was a sex determination test in the palace. The healers lined up. The secretary wrote down the answers the court physicians told him. When everyone was done, only healer Hua was left. The secretary told the young healer to step forward. Wabu stood in front of the screen behind which the pregnant woman was. For this test, he applied X-ray vision. Then he confidently said it was a boy. Before that, the court physician had determined it was a girl. The secretary was puzzled because this young man didn't even check his pulse. To make the test accurate, several pregnant women were invited, and for all of them, Huabu called the sex of the baby using eye X-rays. Mr. Guo and his niece watched what was happening. Go Hyun didn't see any point in this inspection. She asked her uncle if it was possible that healer Hua was joking. Mr. Guo replied that thanks to this healer, he had escaped death twice. Then he told the venerable third concubine what diseases the young man had cured. The secretary continued to write down the answers voiced by Huabu, and Mr. Go added that Hua's healer was definitely a true miracle. The chancellor scrutinized the results of the test. The court healers had the same results. Gong Gyok attributed it to the skill of the doctors. They could not agree in advance but used medical books to determine the sex. But healer Hua's diagnoses were a little different. He was able to determine that the war minister's child was no longer alive. Two of the court healers indicated that this was a possibility. But Healer Hua was absolutely sure of it, and his answers were different from the other 10 healers. If Huabu's diagnoses were correct after the women gave birth, the Chancellor was going to remove all the court physicians and appoint a Hua healer in their place. Gongyuk fearfully replied that excessive calling might displease some officials. However, the Chancellor did not consider the appointment of competent physicians to be anything excessive. Chen Gui wondered if the chief court healer was unsure of his diagnoses. A frightened Gongyuk tried to assure that it wasn't. The Chancellor demanded that the sex of the newborns be ascertained immediately after delivery and reported directly to him. Go Hyun pondered that if Hua's healer had determined everything correctly, then she wasn't pregnant. While in confinement, Huabu practiced and developed his skills. His abilities got better, almost past the side effect of the X-ray vision, and he even pumped up his muscles. Obo's assistant came running to the camera shouting loudly that Mr. Wei's third wife had given birth. It was a boy, and the 30th correctly determined sex of the newborn. Huabu was pleased with his X-ray vision skill. It was better than modern ultrasound. But before that, the young man had given the assistant his homework and wanted to know the result. But Obo couldn't even read, so he couldn't do it. Asking to learn a medical textbook was too much, but Huabu explained everything and hoped the boy would memorize everything. Obo should have learned even if he had to ask for help. But even without reading, his body could memorize complicated things. At this time, the herald began to announce the royal decree. Healer Hua was found innocent and should have been released immediately. The guard unlocked the door, and Huabu was able to leave the dungeon. The overjoyed assistant rushed over to the young healer. The guard added that the Chancellor had demanded that Hua's healer be brought to him, and the young man should be prepared to introduce himself to Chen Gui. Still, it seemed strange to the Chancellor that Huabu's healer was able to diagnose everyone without even checking their pulse. But in the end, this young doctor Mr. Go recommended turned out to be a real miracle worker. One of the court healers said that part of the report on Healer Hua was deliberately omitted. The minister may have had a reason for that, but the Chancellor asked for the omission to be voiced. The report mentioned that the healer Hua opened a clinic in the poor village of Sojong and treated the needy for free. The healer was convinced that this information might have confused the Chancellor, so he did not report it. That a famous doctor did not fulfill his selfish needs could have been the basis for a recommendation to the emperor. The attendant announced the arrival of physician Hua to the Chancellor. Chen Gui greeted the young man and noted his amazing medical skills and how he had changed Mr. Guo. Therefore, the Chancellor wanted to recommend the young man to the sonship of piety and a clean record to the emperor. An embarrassed Huabu replied that with all due respect he did not yet have the knowledge to do so. The Chancellor laughed in response. He thought that the healer wanted to become a civil servant, which confused the young man, but Huabu didn't know how else to politely refuse. The young man replied that only people with very deep knowledge, like his brother, can become civil servants. Huabu himself was still young and eager to treat different patients. This eagerness pleased the Chancellor. Now he's even more worthy of a recommendation. But his youth would be cause for envy and jealousy from his superiors. A maid ran into the reception hall shouting that something important had happened. To the Chancellor's eyes, it was rude, and he immediately asked where the girl's manners were. The maid fell to her knees in tears, but the news was important and concerned Her Highness. Go Hyun in desperation tried to end her life and took poison. She had spent a lot of time crying before, but now her last hope was gone, and even Hua's healer didn't bring good news. She really hoped he would give her a way out. The young healer understood her desire to have a child, but only heaven could order life. He said, "You have to take care of your body, eat nutritiously and get regular exercise." But the girl wasn't listening anymore. All she could think about was not being able to have a baby. She's had several medical examinations, but nothing's changed, and the Chancellor met a new lady who could conceive. All these thoughts made Go Hyun decide to disappear for good. As she uncorked the vial of poison, she wondered if her spouse would mourn her, and prayed to heaven to become an ordinary woman in her next life, and meet a man who will love her alone. The poison took effect instantly, and blood spurted from the girl's mouth. The vial fell out, and the venerable concubine fell to the floor. Upon hearing the noise, a maid came running to find out what had happened to Mistress. She urged the girl to wake up, but Go Hyun asked to let her go to the other world in peace. Upon learning all this, Huabu, accompanied by the Chancellor, rushed to save the girl's life. The court healers tried to get Go Hyun to drink the potion to get the poison out. The Chancellor questioned the maids about why they didn't look after their mistress. Huabu ran up to the healers and asked to be allowed to look at the girl. She was unconscious and couldn't drink the antidote. The young healer was taking a risk, but he needed to drain the poison from her stomach. Another problem was that he didn't have any tubes with him. A panting Obo ran in. He brought the healer's bag with everything he needed. Huabu thanked and praised the bright assistant. First, Her Highness needed to be moved to a bed for treatment. The young man asked one of the healers how much poison she had taken, It turned out to be less than a quarter of a jar. Wabu was glad to hear that the poison had not been drunk completely. When the girl was moved, the young healer prepared a special tube. The tube had been sanitized, and its length should have sufficed. It was now to be inserted into the victim's mouth and deepened into the stomach. Wabu used X-ray vision to successfully accomplish this task. Thanks to him, he saw that the tube was inserted correctly and reached the stomach contents. The young man connected a pump to the tube to remove all foreign matter. He called an assistant to assist him.